Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Nexus 2.0 and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if after 3rd Hokage dead Naruto builds Sakura with Harem Shion Kiba and Team 8 Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Clouds weaving between peaks like snakes and the air so fresh and thinning. 6,572 steps was what it took to reach its gates from the shrine at sea level, and those who made its journey could attest to sore muscles in a peaceful climb. And despite their shameless reputation, Akumo Nin could be noted with three distinct features: their upstanding views on justice, their refusal to back down, and the loyalty they held not for the village but everything the village should stand for. They never once had any particular interests in other villages' individual shinobi aside from leverage and special techniques, and they knew they never would. Today marks the 1-month mark of the Konoha team's capture, sirs, Mabui reported diligently. Her deep green eyes were alight in their depth as both A and Darui offered up their full attention. There has not been a single attempt at escape since their capture, though the guards have noted that they each have recently started exhibiting unusual behaviors. Unusual, A repeated, throwing his arms over the back of the long red couch that served as his office seat. Darui stood just to the side, his hands in his pockets and the usual dull look on his face. Light spilled into the room from the windows that acted as most of the walls. Yes, Raikage-sama, it appears they are teaching themselves, she said as she glanced down at the clipboard in her arms to make sure she was understanding it correctly. The guards hadn't been too sure they were documenting it correctly, but the opinions offered by the attending medics have confirmed that all three Konoha shinobi have been participating in some form of self-education. Darui exhaled softly. Sounds boring. But still, his attention remained sharp as ever. We asked for their names in the beginning and Intel has determined that they did not lie and their identities are who they said they were, and we have been gathering information on them since, she continued. The one in the large jacket and glasses is Aburame Shino. He has been self-mutilating his body and healing the injuries he's caused. This includes breaking bones, tearing muscle, and slashing veins. The guards have not intervened thus far, but medics come in twice a week to assure he's never near death. Mabui, in all her respectful professionalism, couldn't help the slight furrow in her brows. And Darui exchanged startled glances. The one with the fangs is Inuzuka Kiba and the canine is his partner, Akamaru. He has been draining blood to write seal theories on the walls. He's completely written over the floor and 2 of the 4 walls of his cell, and is halfway through the 3rd. A's whole face scrunched in confusion. That's the one without part of her left arm is Sakura, no surname. She has been going through physical exercises to the point of such overexertion that she passes out. In her latest collapse she has not woken in 3 days, and medics had to hook her up to an IV. The guards have said that she sleeps from midnight to 4 in the morning precisely and the schedule is only interrupted by states of unconsciousness. Discomforting quiet filled the office for a beat before a spoke. And who exactly are these 3? Mabui glanced down at her clipboard once more. They're a team who competed and passed the most recent Chunin exams. The one interrupted by Orochimaru and Suna's coordinated attack. Yes, sir, she confirmed. This is the first mission they've taken on as official Chunin. Our sources have confirmed it is at least a B rank and is speculated to have to do with the kidnappings around the Sakai Sea. We don't know exactly which island the Chunin were assigned to, but the trail we followed led to Koinobori Island. Fishy. It's the first word that would pop into anyone's mind hearing that the first time. Investigating kidnappings, even somewhere as remote as the Sakai Sea Islands, could never constitute as a B rank. It's AA rank in the very least and everyone involved should have known that. And B ranks were only assigned to experienced Chunin, so what were fresh out the exam shinobi doing on it? Not to mention they'd gone to the Colosseum and came out alive. They remained at the Colosseum for nearly a month and a half before they retreated to the islands near Lightning where 3 of the 4 of them have been captured by our border patrol. The Aburame are a noble clan in Konoha, Darui noted, his hands slowly coming out of his pockets. Surely word has spread that something's happened to the team and a search party, no matter how small, has been sent for them. Or an alert. You know, something. Mabui shook her head, a troubling feeling seeping through her facade in the way her ring finger twitched against her clipboard. As far as we know, no action has been taken for their retrieval. What's even stranger is that the team believes no one will come for them and has informed us of as such upon their arrival. Of course we thought them to be bluffing, but now, a month later. A's thick eyebrows pulled together and a scowl twisted his lips. What game was Konoha playing? What? They were just going to send an inexperienced Chunin team so far off so close to the destruction of their home village. Had it been his plan, the Chunin would help with the rebuilding while the upper shinobi divisions would be out collecting funds for construction and the other internal issues. The Konoha Council was old enough to understand that much. There are a couple more disconcerting details, Mabui started. She pressed her twitching finger flat against the board and met the eyes of both her boss and comrade with a posture of concern. Surveillance who followed up on Koinobori Island have reported that it has more or less been reduced to ashes, and it's speculated the Chunin team had a hand in the destruction. Though when taking into account Border Patrol's report of the day of their capture and the prison guards' daily observations, were also led to believe that the team had been attacked and restrained minutes before being found by our forces. A was suddenly on his feet. Take me to this Konoha team, he demanded. C walked up and down the short corridor of 3 separate, but occupied cells. His eyes went from the way one boy set himself up to break another one of his bones. If it's his ankle or shin, he'll do this time. He'll never know until he hears a resounding crack, to the other boy who ripped at his skin with his fangs so that his fingers dripped with the blood he used to keep on writing what he was trying to figure out. He's at a loss for, to the girl who'd been dead to the world for 3 days and counting. How she managed to willingly drive herself to such a state was a cause for concern. Then back to the first. All of their items had been confiscated and sent to the analysis division to determine if they were full of traps or jutsu, but nothing had been found. These were Konoha dogs. Despicable shinobi. Enemies to the Kumogakur name. Those whose words could not be trusted. Yet, he couldn't shake what the girl told him before sinking into her current state. We're of no use to you, Nin-san, she told him quietly, respectfully, but with no cowed head. We have nothing to give you, and Konoha won't give anything for us. If we tell them we do indeed have you, send proof. Make sure this isn't some measly threat. She stared him straight in the eye. Then you're just wasting your time, she said. Inexperienced Chunin are expendable. And she didn't break his gaze until he was the one to look away. C grit his teeth. None of this made any sense. These brats, these baby-faced Chunin, couldn't be here for no reason. There was no way, and the only possible information they could extract was clan jutsu or something along those lines, because they were too low of a rank to hold any substantial information about their village, and for some odd reason, those seals examined on the backs of their tongues were determined to be cursed seals, the worst sort of fuinjutsu meant to block verbal freedoms. Prisoners had those, or special forces. But the way Border Patrol had found them injured and incapacitated. He shook his head and sighed. They had what seemed like infinite injuries, amputations, cursed seals on their tongues, brands in the shape of mice on the backs of their necks. And now, they had the prisoner identification bands Kumo tattooed on their forearms. If every shinobi in the world could list every assault on their person throughout their whole careers, half of those wouldn't be half as long as those Konoha nin. C peered into the cell with the Inuzuka and his partner. Both of them were pressed up against an unbloodied corner with the boy's shoulders hunched up to his ears as he tucked his face into white fur. At the sound of the door being thrown open, the Kumo nin forced a blank face and turned towards the sound. Quickly, his heels snapped together and his spine straightened. Raikage-sama, he saluted. Strode in and came to a brisk stop at the cell on the floor. The Aburames. I have finished today's medical assessment of the prisoners. Would you like an oral report of the findings? Is it any different than the other reports? Negative, sir. Then save it for your written report and get me into this cell. Mabui and Darui stood next to see as a guard unlocked the metal door and stepped through the entryway. And he had to pause. When he heard of these Chunin, he was expecting someone who looked, well, like a shinobi. Maybe time at the Colosseum would have them weathered a bit and maybe they'd be more on the sickly side due to the treatment they most likely would have suffered at the hands of such an institution. But he wasn't expecting to see a kid. The boy slumped against the wall had cuts up and down his arms and all across the visible parts of his leg, all of them smeared in dried blood and callously healed so the scars were ripped and jagged, the ink of the identification bands stark against his skin. A half-lidded eye glanced up while the other was merely a socket, an old injury, by the look of it, but an unsettling one nonetheless. The chakra-controlling cuffs around his wrists and ankles made him look smaller, too, and almost felt bad just having to look at him. Reikage-sama, the boy greeted quietly. His roughened voice churned out of his throat like an unoiled gear. What can I do for you? A's brows scrunched. Name, Aburame Shino. How did you come to Lightning Country? By boat from the Colosseum. I believe the island it was on is called Koinobori. A shaky breath left his lips as his body sank even further into the concrete. But he held himself up. It was burning when we left. If it's not gone, we will continue to set fire to it until it is. Behind him, Darui and Mabui shared a look. C pressed his lips together. What village do you hail from? Konoha. You say they won't come for you. Yes. Why? Why? Shino repeated. His eye closed and he went silent for a whole minute. I didn't budge as each second ticked by, even if the tension notched up bit by bit in the unwavering silence. But the boy shifted, using his heels to push him backwards and help prop him up. Because we were never worth it. His head tapped against the wall and some of his cuts began to bleed. Backed up into the hall. His open white haori swished at his knees as he made his way back out the cell block, Mabui and Darui following close behind. Lock it back up and start on more permanent security measures, he ordered. The Konohans are gonna be here a while. And the door shuts, just C and a couple guards left in the hall. After a beat, C took hold of the door and started to push it closed, but not before Shino spoke up again. Much softer, much hoarser, much younger. My team. They're alive, C informed. Shino exhaled out his nose. Thank you. C had no reply for that. He didn't know if it was from the shock of decency or that he had nothing in him to humor a prisoner of the village, but he shut the door without another word and sent out a pulse of his chakra to lock it. Konoha dogs. Baby-faced Chunin. Prisoners. Kids. He left the cell block for the day and headed straight for the hospital. It was almost time for his shift. Didn't know what he was doing, standing in the hall of this floor of the prisoner's block like this. The thick metal of a door stood between him and the cell he stared at, but the key was in the tips of his fingers and the guards knew better than to stop him if he chose to do something unexpected. He was both a personal support of the Yondaime Reikage and a high-level medic operating at Sirius Central Hospital, the largest medical center for shinobi and shinobi-related research. It was a pride of his, being able to offer his services. Not many Kumo nin became medics, and even then, most of those who did gravitated towards the field instead of allowing themselves to be sequestered in their village's high peaks. He understood the feeling. Truly, he did. There was a certain thrill of staying alive to heal in the midst of battle instead of watching comrade after comrade get wheeled into a white room and never knowing if it would be your own fault if they couldn't be saved. But that didn't erase the issue of the slowly declining number of available medics at all their facilities. The civilian doctors did their jobs well, but there would always be cases they could never have a hope of taking on themselves. Kumo needed medics. And there was one on the other side of that thick metal door using chakra he wasn't supposed to have access to and wasting it on healing cuts and breaks and strains he inflicted on himself. Self-education, Mabui described it as. C tapped a finger against his thigh. Another. Again. He turned and walked out of the hall. What do you mean you're putting off the surgery? He doesn't have 3 more days. There's no one who can take it. What about Q? He hasn't had any DOS in 5 days. Where the hell's Arashi? Cack. We just got a squad in from. C's pen almost shattered in his grip as he braced himself on one of the admin counters, 6 or 7 files under his hands. The common behind him wasn't new, far from it. Medics couldn't operate on a 24/7 basis, and that was what Cirrus needed, especially with their dwindled numbers and the fact that the entire staff was stretched too thin. The smaller specialty clinics like Cumulus Memorial or Nimbus Point tried their best to accommodate extra patients when they could, and Stratus Medical Center was a civilian-only facility, leaving the medics with no other option but to buck up until they passed out from chakra exhaustion. He rubbed at his eyes and the bags he was sure were purpling under them. He thought about the ragged staff, the patients, the sleep he hadn't gotten in almost 52 hours. He thought about a thick metal door. He gritted his teeth and leaned forward over the files. 2 of them needed paperwork done for surgeries and the others needed their daily checks to be cleared and handed off to the nurses. What he tried not to think about was how much lighter the medic workload would be if there was another trained body in the hospital. The guard who marked his arms told him the ink was made out of a small tree native only to Wind and Lightning Country. Ground and crushed and mixed into a rich brown paste, the brush dipped into it wound around his forearms 3 times, twice by the wrists and once near the elbow. Each band was broad, maybe 3 or so centimeters wide, and burned with the chakra that traveled from hand to hilt to bristle to skin. The ink was a stain, the guard had said. Without chakra application, it'd fade in a few weeks, and it made for a lot of design and tradition among the Sunnies. But its permanence marked its prisoners with its earthy color tethering them far away from the clouds. The guard chuckled a bit, then. Just a bit of Kumar superstition. Shino thought the bands would look nicer if he'd chosen to wear them. The metal cuffs covered most of the first band, and the second and third were littered with all sorts of scars from the cuts he tore himself and healed with all the chakra he could pull from his restraints. The collars from Nezu and company were harsher and left him wheezing and struggling to focus, but these ones only left him winded and tired, and before he knew it, he'd be waking up some time later with new scars and the same locked door across his cell. But we don't have to fight anyone here, he murmured to himself. We don't have to kill. We don't have to watch our backs. He shifted, and his bare feet skimmed along the hard floor. The plain black pants they issued him caught a bit of dust at the bottom hem, and the matching shirt was thick enough to keep the concrete's cool touch off his back. We're still alive. They're still alive. Are they still alive? He shook his head and dragged his knees to his chest. They are. They'll survive. They will. Why? It's what we do best. Always. His Kikai hummed in assurance. But he didn't know how long he could keep believing it himself. Just as he wrapped his arms around his waist and settled himself against a corner, if it was night or day he wouldn't know, and his eyes were slipping closed, a thrum echoed in his ears and the door swung open. It wasn't the Rakage this time. It was the blonde medic. Though he wasn't as blank-faced as all the other times he'd seen him. His arms were crossed and his shoulders weren't as rigid as they usually were, and the frown that marred his face was nothing like the simple flat line that normally met him. Can you stand? The medic asked. Shino answered by pushing himself up to his feet, only swaying once and catching himself on the wall before he could tip over. The other granted him a once-over before motioning for him to step out of the cell and to follow him down the hallway. He did so with no reluctance. His back straightened, his shoulders pulled back, and he set his eyes straight ahead of him. His arms were nothing but crisscrosses of burgundy scabs, and there was a dug-out valley that peeked up the collar of his shirt, pink and half-healed. Not a sound spilled out his mouth as they passed the wary, yet curious guards and walked down the spiraling flights into what Shino assumed was the prison's confiscation repository. The medic picked up a tattered green jacket, inspected the sleeves for a few beats, then shoved it the boy's direction. "Wear it," he ordered. Shino did, but only for the ends of the sleeves to stop half a palm length away from his wrists and for the back to stretch taut over his shoulders, and it suddenly dawned on him how long he'd been staring at plain gray walls since Kumo, since the Colosseum. Since Sai. Shino's whole world blurred and refocused in what to him felt like merely a second, but it must have been a long enough time for the medic to have left and come back with another jacket. He, again, said nothing as he shucked off his tea-green coat for one the same Kumo gray color the guards wore. The sleeves brushed against the beginnings of his thumb, covering both the cuffs and the bands. "Is this protocol for your prisoners?" The medic, who'd taken his wrists to push up the sleeves and wrap bandages around his forearms, barely glanced upward at the query. "Protocol for pre-execution." The bandaging on his left arm was pulled a little too tight. Black eyes snapped up to his, fire sparked in its dark depths as the medic finished wrapping his arms and straightened. "Why is that your expectation? Why would it not be?" Shino replied. His arms fell to his side. "Your border patrol didn't kill us when they found us. You have everything that was once in our possession. You've learned you can't glean important information because of the seals on our tongues." He paused, but didn't notice the paper-thin crease that sprouted between his brows. "What month is it, Medic-san?" "November." Ah, it was sort of bright in the repository. His kikai crawled along his insides, their spindly legs idly weaving and idly wondering if he would get his glasses back to shield his sensitive eye. But he didn't think he'd get them back. What use would glasses be for the dead? We'd left Konoha sometime in August. It was fall in Konoha. Sakura said she'd found a persimmon tree on one of their D ranks outside the village, and after a more than enthused Kiba made her promise to take them there when it ripened so he could see how much he could stuff into his mouth at once. November would have been perfect. Perhaps it's selfish of me, but I suppose I wouldn't mind being the first to die. Shino muttered more to himself and his insects than the other in the room. His gaze sought out his glasses on the other side of the room. He stared at its blurred outline, missing the paper-thin crease deepening on the medic's face. "I'd die knowing they're still alive. Because if I was the last one to go, He trailed off and met the medic's blank stare. "Mateam." He didn't know this was a medic whose reserve was slowly crumbling around his eyes at the sight of someone whose 13 years were not long enough to fear the deaths of others over the death of himself. This was it. This was the one. The worst decision he'd ever made in his entire life. If only he didn't give in to the pressures of the hospital, the sight of his friends and coworkers falling to fatigue and exhaustion and to the voices in their heads berating them for not being able to do enough. If only they didn't have this problem of too many patients and not enough interest in the healing arts to make up for the strain in the industry. If only he never knew about what was behind that thick metal door. "They're alive," C answered, "and you won't be dying today." He pulled out a pair of Kumo-issued sandals off one of the shelves and set it at the boy's feet before snatching up the orange glasses and throwing them over as well. "You are now a Shino without a surname who grew up in a small village along Lightning's border. You have medical training and have come to Kumogakure to expand on it, and I am the superior that has signed off on your request to work at Cirrus Central Hospital," he said. "Your restraints will now allow you access to your chakra as long as it converts to medical chakra upon release. Your kikaichu are to stay out of sight. You are never allowed anywhere without supervision. And," he loomed forward, a mask of complete apathy on his face, "no one will ever learn who you are, nor will anyone see a millimeter of your forearms or the cuffs at your ankles that the sandals will hide. Is that understood?" Shino turned his uncracked glasses in his hands and wiped a smear of dirt off the right lens with his thumb. He slipped them on and thought of Aoba. "Understood, Medic-san." The blonde nearly scoffed as he ushered him out a back entrance of the building. "My name is C. This was an absolutely terrible idea. Sato Akemi unlocked the door to her shop when the sun started to barely crest over the horizon. Normally she wouldn't be so early, but a couple shipments were set to arrive in an hour and she promised the delivery man she wouldn't make him wait as long as he did last time because, well, it hadn't been her fault her alarm clock had fizzed out on her that morning, but she'd make sure to come extra early just in case. As the lock clicked and she took a single step through the threshold, a particularly chilly breeze swept past her and goosebumps rose on the skin of her arms. Her wind chimes rattled, and there was nothing behind her but a cloudless sky and the beginning of a perfect day. We can feel December's breath in our bones. Mabui's heels were silent on the stone stairs as she ascended to one of the higher floors of the building. Katatumbo Penitentiary didn't typically carry too many inmates and hadn't held prisoners from another country in years. They'd been lying low since the failed abduction of the Hyuga heiress nearly a decade past, and shinobi from other nations were smart in avoiding their borders. Katatumbo didn't even have 15 current occupants. As a shinobi prison, one would think it a relatively low number compared to the 50-plus civilian staccato detention centers held. She nodded at the guards as she entered the hall and looked into the first cell. It was empty, and this time she didn't panic, not like the first time. The guards had to jump to stop her from sounding the alarm and hastily explained something like, "C-sensei had him," or, "It was all C-sensei's idea," and when she burst into the hospital for that blonde head of hair, she ran into Shino himself in the midst of assessing a group of new patients and handing off newly filled forms to the attending nurses. She'd been pulled aside by a near-disheveled C before she could reveal anything incriminating, and even though having a secret prisoner work for the betterment of Kumo wasn't necessarily a thing, the stats surrounding Cirrus Central Hospital had been showing signs of a general increase and she couldn't argue with the numbers. Reikage-sama tried to. His outrage sent his couch careening out the window, but after seeing how well the Aburame shouldered the extra work, in turn taking some of the bulk off the actual resident medics, the only punishment C received was sitting at the end of a 3-hour-long rant and getting taken off the mission roster for 6 months. Mabui peered into the next cell. Not too long ago the walls had been filled to the brim with nonsensical symbols and reasoning that wound around in circles and circles before they got back to the same place they started. The boy, the Inuzuka, had ripped off part of his black pants to scrub his dried blood off the walls so he had room to puzzle out even more of whatever ran through that mind of his canine watching the whole time while he crossed his shackled paws beneath his jaw. The last cell in the hall held the girl trudging through one-armed pull-ups while being hooked up to an IV drip. She was the only one of her team to request the guards for things: a wooden bar and a resistance band. The resistance band she tied to one end near the center of the wooden bar on the ceiling and the other end tied around to the remains of her left arm. Mabui quietly admired her resolve. C had noted her amputation had been recent in her initial examination, not more than a month old by the time they landed in Kumo's clutches. She stepped away from the cell and made her way back down the hall. There were a few more things she had to do before reporting back to Reikage-sama, such as drop off some documents for the Cipher Division and collect the weekly update from the Seals Division. She paused in front of the middle cell again and rushed to peer through the small window in the door. Sharp eyes darted wall to wall, top to bottom, sentence to sentence of blood-tinted words and crude diagrams brought to life with the pricked pad of a finger. Locks, matrices, sequences, layers, odds, evens, primes, margins, ratios. Seals. Seal theory. Every single available concrete space was crammed with seal theory. When she tried to read those brown-crusted words in a new light, those circles made a little more sense in the way they curved and the starting points weren't at all the same with their tweaked angles and shifted perspectives. She didn't know how long she stood there gaping at the advanced scrawls, but by the time she reached the bottom of one of the walls, the dog had stalked into her line of vision with hunched hackles and eyes too guarded and wary to be anything intimidating. The Chunin stopped writing. "Huh, what's up, boy?" Akamaru barked lowly and he turned towards the small slip of a window on his locked door. But no one was there. Kiba pat his partner on the head. Which one was it? A bark. Green eyes, silver hair. Not a guard. A small huff. Huh. Wonder what she wants. He spun back on his heel and toward a wall as he pricked the scabbed pad of his pointer finger with one of his fangs and pressed it up against the concrete. Quote. Hey, Akamaru. Akamaru raised his head and it to the side. You think we're gonna rot here? You know, in a Kumo jail. There was silence as a tail thumped against the floor in consideration. His partner whined quietly before resting his head on the shackles around his front legs. Kiba's brow furrowed for the slightest moment and he sighed. Yeah, he murmured. At least it's not the Colosseum. He dragged his finger through another line of theory, even quieter, or getting stabbed in the back in Konoha. Mabui willed herself to move away from her place beside the chakra-sealed door, confusion in her eyes and an unfinished to-do list on the forefront of her mind. Her heels were silent. The knot guard lady didn't come by again for a while. Akamaru didn't notice anything and neither did he, though Kiba couldn't really say how long it had been. He could barely keep track of time back when they bulldozed through books and books of research and they had Sakura in the Colosseum to count down the days that passed to the hour. But here, no windows, no sun, no nothing. The guards brought in food twice a day at different times to really hammer in the loss of awareness and pushed it through a small hatch at the bottom of the door with a latch that could only open from the outside. He was surprised when the prison served them meat every other meal, unlike Nezu and company who'd only ever served them rice and vegetables. He thought Kumo was supposed to be the hard-ass country. There was the ringing click of the hatch and two plastic trays are pushed through the slot. Kiba reached to pull them close but stopped halfway when the hatch didn't shut as quickly as it usually did. Akamaru was immediately on his feet with his claws out and his legs set like a spring was coiled within them. A handful of seconds passed before a plain glass ink bottle and a capped brush was slipped through, followed by a manila folder with a post-it note on the front. What is the overlay? The hatch shut. Overlay. Kiba mumbled. Akamaru sniffed at the folder as he pulled it into his lap and flipped it open. Inside were pages of notes and chicken scratch of trying to puzzle out the complete seal overlay from the configurations written out on the first page. 2 barks. Yeah. They probably want me to do some shit for 'em, but. He shuffled through more of the papers. What's the point? I'm just some dumbass kid from Konoha. The folder shut and got tossed to the other side of the cell and the trays pulled forward. But hey, don't gotta use blood for the walls anymore, I guess. He shoveled unseasoned pork bites into his mouth, bloody writing at his back and his partner at his side. 2 meals were served and the folder was still in the same place he tossed it. Kiba hated that more often than not he caught himself lingering on the folder and the post-it note as his fingers itched for something new to work on. There was only so much he could dig up from all the stuff he learned before, from what he could read in the library or what Iruka-sensei taught him, and at this point, the theories on the walls were just him writing to write. But if he worked on whatever was in that folder. He groaned and slid onto the ground, capping the brush and setting it next to the near-empty ink bottle. Akamaru's tail thumped a couple of times against the floor as he swung his head around to look at his partner. I really wanna look at that overlay stuff, but it'd be like me doing Kumo a favor, right? Kiba asked. Why would I do something like that? Akamaru stared at the folder for a few moments and woofed. Quote. Yeah, I guess. I'm askin' why I should do Kumo anything when Konoha never did nothing for us either. Wasn't that right? When Sarutobi Hiruzen was alive he'd done the equivalent of cutting off their tongues and sending them on mission after mission in hopes they'd never make it back for another. And after his death he'd damned them again by turning them chunin by decree and somehow, letting Danzo have his way. Letting Sai them all over. Kiba exhaled through his nose. No. He shouldn't blame Sai. He should be blaming himself for thinking he could trust him. When the small hatch opened next and 2 trays were slid through, The folder was pushed out before it closed, the inside covered in freshly dried ink and the finished overlay boxed on the very last page. : It's all correct. Correct. This work is borderline ingenious. The seals technician exclaimed as he spread the notes on the table. Mabui peered at the one particular sequence he pointed out. Take this for example. The team and I tried to work it from top to bottom, then bottom to top, as one normally goes about figuring how to complete sequences and matrices or anything of the link. He then pointed at the writing, not quite in the middle, but close. Maybe a few characters off. But this is the starting point. Clearly marked, too. I don't know how you could possibly start so off-center, but the outcome. It would have taken us maybe a week or two longer to go about it the usual way, but you took this a couple of days ago. He turned to her fully, eyes wide and shining. Who managed to solve it so quickly? I'd love to have someone like that on the team. Oh, Mabui smiled, easily covering up the quiet anxiety trembling beneath her professional front. When I received your weekly update and found you to be struggling with this particular seal, there was an associate I've come across who I believed could help. It seems my hunch was not only a hunch. The seals technician knew that the term, associate, was more or less a nod to the fact that whoever managed to solve an advanced overlay like that one was meant to be kept on the down low or not even mentioned at all. He shrugs it off. It wasn't like he was a stranger to shinobi affairs. You know, if those scrolls you'd taken off those prisoners hadn't been marked highly classified, I'd be hunting down that associate right now to try and get them to break those locks, he sighed. Mabui's expression tightened slightly. Well, of course Inuzuka would be able to break those locks since it looked like he'd been the one to craft them himself, and it was something the seals technician didn't see. Could your associate come down one of these days? It would really help us out. A bead of cold sweat ran down the back of her neck. I'll see what I can do. Thank you very much, Mabui-senpai. She left the building with a particularly sharp pain in her forehead and an image behind her eyes of a bemused C raising an eyebrow at her in his rare disbelief. : During the meal right after Kiba had sent the folder out, the hatch opened and a third tray was slipped into the cell. On it was a plate of something that looks like pink cotton candy, but somehow thicker and gummier than anything he'd seen in Konoha. Thank you. The note read. If there's anything you'd like, please let me know. A part of him wanted to snort and ask to be set free, but as he glanced down at the silver at his wrists and the dark brown embedded in his arms, he couldn't find the energy in himself to make the joke. He was tired. So tired. Kiba flipped the post-it note over and scrawled on it with the last of his ink before he slid it back through the hatch, and it shut. I want to know if my team's okay. He went back to his meal not expecting an answer, and Akamaru sniffed his food before he latched onto a bone with quite a bit of marrow at the center. The hatch opened once more, slowly, and a soft voice floated through. It was deep and rich, and Kiba's mind immediately tacked it onto green eyes and silver hair. They're all right, she told him. Before he could even think to reply, the hatch closed and it was quiet again. Just him, Akamaru, and the writing on the walls. : Kisame wasn't ashamed to admit that he'd felt relief when they weren't able to capture Uzumaki Naruto. It was a couple weeks back when they'd escaped the Toad Sanin's trap and reported back to leader empty-handed, but none of that deterred him even after they'd been dismissed by the static chrome of his projection. He'd taken to bugging Itachi about getting checked out by a medic one way or another, and if not for the whole thing with his lungs, then at least for his eyes that he'd overused. So here he was, sat in a too small plastic chair in a shinobi optical specialist's waiting room, rain pattering against the windows and the receptionist trying his best not to look him in the eye. Kisame glanced at the pile of old magazines at the short table to his left and picked up the one on the top of the stack and leafed through it with unfocused eyes. Uzumaki was even smaller up close. At the Chunin exams he'd seen the boy on the other side of the arena, loud and impatient and smiling for pup. In the hallway in the middle of that tourist town, Kisame could see how short he really was: unkempt blonde hair, confused blue eyes, clothes a little too worn to be passed off as just from training. He didn't kill kids. Never had, never would. But he wondered just why Konoha wanted to kill one of their own kids by shoving a demon behind a baby's navel. He sighed and tossed the unread magazine back on the table. He leaned back, and the plastic creaked slightly under the movement. It would be a while until he could head back to Konoha since their new implementation of a stricter policy, meaning he couldn't check up on Pup like he'd planned on originally. And all it took was an invasion by a literal Sannin to get them to up their security, he griped internally. A hand came down to rest on his left shoulder just beside his bandaged seal, and he looked up. Itachi and his faintly cloudy black eyes stared down at him. Shall we? Kisame stretched his legs and stood as he slipped his hat over his head. His partner followed suit as they both stepped into the rain-stained streets. True to AIM culture and produced from the Amex that lived there, the cement streets were covered in neon art almost ingrained in its foundation. Little paintings of things like cranes and frogs flowed bright orange and pink and green and purple under the torrential downpour. The scarce visitors that came were always amazed. The natives knew it wasn't just art. Kisame remembered how Pup would always hop on the green lily pads when they walked the streets at night, her bright laughter echoing in his ears. The memory was grainy, now. He hadn't heard her laugh in so long. Hey, Itachi-san, let's head to that tea house ya, like. I'm kinda cravin' that orange spice tea they got. Itachi tilted his head. It's been a while since I've had their green tea. They walked along the gleaming caricatures beneath their sandals in a village where red lanterns hung over the streets and neon signs brightened the skies in a way the sun never could. In January we've lost a winter. B. I'm serious. And I'm tellin' you not ta. Sweat, so why's what you're doin', as fret. A slammed his fist against the desk and a crack ran through the center. You know damn well why I am. Because once you get an idea in that damn thick head of yours I need to send at least 3 of my top shinobi to stop you before you try. He sighed and shook the splintered wood from his hands. Just don't look into it. Please. 2 of them are already off the leash and that's enough of a headache as it is. 2. A glared. B raised 2 placating hands. Lips sealed. That the deal. Won't do nothin' that'll wrinkle that mug, bro. Yuki's snort echoed in his head as he slipped out the office and straight towards the exact place he told his brother he wouldn't near. Of all the things you could have invested yourself in, this is what you choose. I shouldn't be surprised. You're tellin' me those secret Konoha nin locked up ain't interestin'. I'm telling you that you should listen to your brother and heed the potential consequences of your actions, dumbass. Well, you can sit back and watch the show cause I'ma find out what I wanna know. Yuki huffed and said nothing else. Killer Bee chuckled under his breath at his friend's exasperation before he stepped into the chilled air of Kumo's high peaks. Even though he walked down the smaller streets with less vendors and even less people, he could see the neat, slanted overhangs and the benches and gazebos perched atop roofs. Stairs were attached on the sides of each building that wound up to the gazebos and suspended bridges crisscross over the streets, shadowing markets and walkways and where civilians could traverse over more than just the ground. The Kumar had always wanted to be as far from the ground as they could. Maybe that was why all the children learned to scale steeps and cliffsides as quickly as they learned to walk. He smiled and waved at someone sweeping up the front of their shop. The owner took one look at him and promptly turned their back to continue sweeping. B had spent over 20 years staring at the turned backs of those who wanted nothing to do with him that the action didn't lessen his grin as he continued on his way. The younger villagers tolerated him much more than the older ones did, which was far more that he could have asked for, but was it wrong to wish he'd meet someone who didn't already have an image of what type of person he'd be? Just because he wasn't like them. Just because one of his closest friends had ravaged the village even before he was born. Couldn't they just give them a fair chance? B. He replied aloud. Say something, you. The Hachibi didn't respond as Katatumbo crawled into his sights. Killer B instantly perked up and didn't even try to sneak past the guards. He strolled through and they were either too intimidated or knew better than to stop him. He was quick to traverse up the stairs to the flood he'd been specifically ordered not to go to and bursts through the door. The guard stood between the confiscation repository and the hallway of cells, almost slumped at the sight of him. B-sama, you're not supposed to be here. Reikage-sama gave clear instructions for you not to be on the penitentiary's premises, she said. Damn, how long ago did I give the order? Could I advise that you train instead? Or to check in with the wall patrol since it's part of your duty as village guardian? Ah, come on Enmu, let me see one of the Konahans. What's the worst I could do? They got their chakra locked as far as I heard, and I'm just wondering what stirred the word on these birds. Enmu's sound wasn't amused, but her black painted lips twitched and her pale pink eyes narrowed. Tell you what, if I get in and you don't tell my bro, I'll snatch you those burgers by the grotto. She a blonde-ish white brow that was nearly as pale as her own skin. I guess I get why you're so interested in those kids. No one really knows about them, but the ones that do can't really get a read on what's what. B blinked behind his dark glasses as the smile slowly faded from his face. Kids. Enmu jerked her head towards the hall and settled back against one of the walls. Check it for yourself, B-sama. She tilted her head. And I want a burger for lunch tomorrow from the blue shack in front of the cracked arch. The cracked arch was one of the bigger grottos and had more locals hanging from the ledges than bats. He hummed absently as he slipped into the hall. The first cell was empty and so was the second, but the third cell. A girl with pink hair with one arm held herself in a handstand. Drenched skin stretched taut over hardened muscle and there was no lapse in her form. Her toes pointed towards the ceiling and the IV drip taped to the junction of her elbow ran as smoothly as the sweat that dripped from the tip of her nose to the cold hard floor. So the prisoner's really a kid. And a Konoha shinobi caught within our borders, Yuki reminded him firmly. Don't get any ideas, B. You've already done enough by disobeying your brother. Go home. I just told Enmu I'd buy her a burger to not talk to a prisoner. Nah. That's a waste. B. Don't. B's hand was already on the door. The locks immediately began to open and that mischievous part of his brain was always so smug that no matter the security clearance, his chakra would always be recognized as per the requirements of the village guardian position. He squeezed through the smallest crack of the door he could manage and closed it behind him just as quick. The girl stayed planted on her hand for a long few seconds before she lowered on foot on the ground, then stood to full height. It surprised him that the top of her head reached taller than his shoulder. You're not one of the guards usually in this building, she said. He a brow and leaned back against the concrete. And why's that you're thinking when you're just a cucumber in this cell picklin'? When she turned to face him fully, her black prisoner's shirt did nothing to hide those rippling scars that spanned from her shoulder blade to her jawline and ended ripped and ragged at the bottom of her cheek. Though it wasn't her appearance that quite caught him, but it was the lingering chakra of whatever caused it that pulled at his senses. It was familiar. It was angry. It was just like Yu's. Your hands, she answered. Her gaze flickered down at them. They're not the same ones that deliver the meals. So it's either you're a new guard that's paid me a visit or you're not a guard at all. She held her hand behind her back, the IV tube swaying slightly with the movement. Her chin never dipped. What can I do for you? Respectful is the first word that popped into mind at her display, which was surprising in itself considering young shinobi never have their arrogance curbed until they lose themselves in their first kills or their first capture or the first time they needed to obey an order they could only wish to forget. He was curious. Did she stand tall because she didn't know what she was doing or because she knew all too well what she'd gotten into? B pointed to the IV bag. Why have they got you hooked up? I train until I can't and they don't want me dead. No, but I don't know why. Her fingers curled beneath the thin plastic tube and gave it a light tug. Konoha has no warmth for Kumo and vice versa, and you must have realized we're worth nothing more than wild animals you happen to pick up on your borders. Green eyes were blank and cold and not so bitter, and it cast an eerie light in the dim prison cell. I'm waiting for my execution, sir, but I didn't think I'd be waiting this long. Gyu hadn't said anything in a while, but B could clearly see him in his mind's eye. The beast quietly observed the exchange, his 8 extra arms tucked beneath him and his 2 main ones crossed over his chest. Her name. Huh. Ask for it. He rolled his eyes beneath his glasses and passed on the message. The girl raised one of her brows. Sakura. No surname. Konoha never really had interesting shinobi. Maybe there were a few autumn leaves in the sea of green like Kiroi Senku, the yellow flash, or Ikizokugoroshi, the clan killer, but the pink is new. And, undoubtedly, one of the more interesting things he'd come across these days. Sakura. Then, he acknowledged simply. B left the cell after that, stopping at the end of the hall and at the receiving end of one of Enmu's deadpan looks. Did you get what you came for? She asked. Didn't know what I came for. Not really, he said. He jerked a thumb at his head. But I got something up here, ideally. Keep it hush, shush, word's not gonna get out, but I think I found an interesting sprout. Enmu's forehead wrinkled like she wanted to argue, but she only sighed noisily and rubbed the bridge of her nose. I really can't keep up with you, B-sama. Single quote ... I wonder if there was someone out there, he thought as he set out of Katatumbo for the day. Someone other than a that could keep up with me. ... Sakura had her head pressed against one of the walls when the stranger walks in again. She counted just a little over 24 hours before he'd shown up again, but she didn't open her eyes or push away from the wall when she heard his sandals tap gently against the floor. There was a faint rustle, and she figured he crouched to be at least eye level with her. Is it raining? She asked. Showers started some time ago, supposed to creep through the day, all snails pace slow, he replied. What? Can you tell from here? The building's soundproof, ya fool. Her father once told her the rains in AIM were unnatural. He always joked about God and his temper, God and his complex, and she loved the little stories he thought up for her. But it wasn't until she was a bit older and a bit wary that she began to understand why Leader Sama was worshipped just as much as he was feared. He laced his chakra in the rain, she figured. And maybe that was why even when the skies were blue and clear over Konoha, she would always know when to tell Kiba not to keep Akamaru outside for too long. But I was right. Guess you were. She opened her eyes and faced the stranger to find him with a hand on his chin and his gaze far off and considering. 2 blue tattoos sat just beneath his left eye along that socket bone, and there were more swords strapped to his back than seemed sensible. Not a guard. A regular force shinobi, maybe. Maybe not. He must be high enough to gain clearance to sit around her cell doing nothing and looked old enough to have established himself as someone important in the village. Idly, she cursed herself at not having kept up to date on Kumogakure's history and politics. She'd been too busy digging up Konoha's and Suna's pasts and problems, but she knew that wasn't an excuse. All right then, the stranger decided. He stood and popped open the door. Let's go. He disappeared from her line of sight. And left the door wide open. Sakura blinked once before she slowly rose and shuffled to peer into the hallway. The stranger had his arms crossed as he waited near the end of it, bobbing his head side to side to a rhythm she couldn't hear. She glanced back at her cell, then the hall, then him. Breathe in, out. Straighten your back. Lift your chin. Not too much. Never lower your eyes. This is not arrogance. This is not intimidation. This is practicality. She strode forward like there wasn't the weight of 3 other worlds on her shoulders. She would never know the way Gyuki's head tilted at the sight of her. Enmu's sound was halfway through her burger when the last prisoner of the hallway stepped into view. She stared. The girl stared back. After B took a cloak from the repository and handed it to the girl to slip on, Sound sunk her teeth into another bite of her burger and slumped against the wall. B-sama, you do know that I'm now required to inform Raikage-sama of your actions. I'll have her back in the cell in a while, he waved. Don't get tangled in your knots, I'll keep her low profile. They were both out before Sound could give another long-suffering sigh. Her groan echoed through the prison block before it was muffled by a mouthful of bread and buffalo patties. Kumogakure floated on the clouds. Sakura's gaze flickered at everything she could spot through the low hood and the light rain and saw the dozens of plateaus connected by the bridges that made up the village, all different heights with trees sticking out the sides with swings wrapped around their sturdy branches. She committed everything to memory. She tried, but the smell of something that isn't dust and concrete made her head spin. But dust and concrete was better than blood. They crossed to a plateau far from the main districts, raised much higher than most of the other platforms and dotted with steps carved into its side that wind all the way around, narrow and cracked and steeped. But even as she looked down at the clouds and the endless fall below, all she could think about was the air. Air was always thick with the musk of rainwater and the heat of neon signs. It was a scent of heavy spice from the curry stalls and moss that settles in the cracks and crevices of dark brick and stone. In Konoha, it was an air of green leaves and green tea and green stalks of flowers sold from the Yamanaka flower shop. It was an air of sun and sweat, of tree sap and woodwork. Kumo's air was thin like breathing hot air on a cold morning, and it was new. At the top of their silent climb they stepped onto a mesa with no boundaries and with their clothes soaked from the rain. Sakura tipped her head back, letting the droplets splatter on her cheeks. Pink hair ran down to just about the middle of her back, and she wondered just how long it had been that it no longer nagged her that it needed to be tied up and out of reach. But she supposed prisoners had no need for. The metal bands around her wrists' ankles release every last drop of her chakra, and with a face still turned up at the heavens that never smiled at her, she breathed. And instantly ducked away from the foot careening towards her head. You, take a look. She dodged that hook I cooked and there's a fire in her eyes. Makes me wanna check just what she's gonna try. The sky rumbled and he grinned as she aimed a kick to his face that he blocked. She used his arms to launch herself behind him to try and snag one of the swords on his back, but a pivot in his elbow was soaring for her stomach. She twisted hard enough that her cloak whipped off and she used the brief distraction to make another grab for a sword at his hip. Hey, I ain't gonna let you snatch one of these, he chided. B gripped her hand and chucked her far enough that she slid to a stop just before she could topple off the mesa. These blades right here you ain't allowed to seize. Afraid I'll break them, she called out as she swiped a trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth. Afraid you'll bring me tears with a bad form, fool, ya fool. He laughed. Konahans don't know how to wield a sword if it's the last thing they do. You, expect me to believe what's different's gonna be you. Sakura flexed her fingers, all 5 of them up to count. If you don't think Konahans are at your level, then how does an Amek compare to a Kumar? She's Amek. Yuki hummed. He plopped his chin on his hand as he watched her through his host's eyes. Explains the attitude with the rain. An immigrant to Konoha then, maybe too, boy. B unsheathed a sword from his back and threw it blade first. She let it pass over her shoulder until the start of the hilt slid just past her peripheral, and her hand came up to lock around the red bandages. Not a goosebump on her skin came from the chilled rain, and he snorted. Definitely an Amek. He took a single sword for himself. Single quote. B. I want the truth. Even with only one arm she held the sword like it was her own, tipped slightly in front of her and knees slightly bent and ready for action. She lunged. So did he. What's on your mind, you? Most of her blocks are in perfect form save for the blows he directed at her left side. She wasn't used to the opening and it was obvious, but her determination made up for it with awkward angles and the way it was like she was meant to carry a blade. What are you doing? B shunshin behind her and twisted a free hand in her hair while the other pressed sharpened silver against her neck. But just as quick as he trapped her he lost her, and he was left with a dense clump of pink snagged on his calluses as she retreated to the other end of the mesa. She'd taken the weapon, held it to the base of her skull, and sheared it all the way up. He blinked, and she sunk into another fighting stance. The rain pelted harder and the clouds were at their darkest gray, and as the skies filled with lightning, he found himself laughing amongst the thunderclaps as he twirled the sword in his hand. Let's roll, kid. You never answered me, Yuki said after B locked Sakura back in her cell with a dry set of prisoner uniforms and skillfully avoids sound to avoid any questions. By night the rain had let up some, but there was no use in getting dry until he got back home. You wasted your whole day humoring that little Amek. Little, she's way taller than Enmu. All you humans are insignificant, but that's beside the point. The beast snapped. The girl, B. Why did you bring her out of the cell? Why did you fight her? Why did you lend her one of your swords? Why did you bother? Until your brother comes to a decision about them, they're prisoners on death row and shouldn't be treated as comrades. What are you thinking? Nothing much. Really. Yuki drawled. And what exactly has kept you so occupied that you're forgetting your obligation to your duties? B walked onto one of the rope bridges that connect plateau to plateau, careful to mind the third step that had never been fixed since the day he broke through it nearly 7 years ago while he was running away from A. Dunno. He shrugged. Probably the same stuff that got C in Mabui. The Hachibi sighed and rubbed a hand over his eyes. But B didn't listen, his hands tucked in his pockets and an old tune whistling past his lips. Yuki knew he should raise his voice to get his idiot's attention and try to knock some sense into that hollow head of his, but he heard the words that have been rattling around his host's brain since the day he heard it and relented with another loud sigh. I really can't keep up with you, B-sama. No Kumar could keep up with their Jinchuriki guardian, Killer B. So why did B think an Amek in Konohan clothing could? Senju Tsunade was the 5th Hokage and she couldn't give any less of a damn about what everyone else thought about it even if she tried. She spent her days in her office with a bottle of sake on her desk and a sharp tongue to lash if anyone came to her with stupid shit laced on their tongues. Hell, she'd already garnered a reputation of an iron fist after reducing an incompetent nurse to tears with a single sentence and demolishing a wall of the hospital when they couldn't make up their minds about costs of expansion and filling her ears with useless whines and drivel. But currently, the one thing that pissed her off to no end lay on her desk. 6 broken pens piled up by her chair and her assistant, one Kato Shizune, stood just out of range of the Hokage's blast zone as she clutched Taunton close to her chest. 3 stacks of paper were stacked heavy beside her desk and 10 more smaller stacks sat innocently around her workspace. Why is there so much paperwork today? She managed out of ground teeth. It's, Tsunade-sama, the system these papers go through is a long process and only now have all of these been approved for you to read and sign, and Tsunade-sama, we just got that desk yesterday. Get me the dumbasses in charge of this useless system right now. She demanded, a fist through her brand new desk. Shizune quickly bowed and sprinted from the office without a second to spare as pages flew all around her. And somewhere, buried under stacks and stacks of papers and folders and staples, there was an unread report from a mission assigned over 5 months prior. In February we've lost a home. A sat facing the windows, his office empty save for the steaming cup of tea on his desk and the completed stack of paperwork just waiting to be picked up by the errand boy that would come by in a few hours. His head rested in his palm and his fingers curled against his goatee. It was a nice day out. And he was pretty sure those Konoha Chunin were enjoying it just as much as the next Kumo citizen. He tipped his head back to rest against the couch, eyes on the wooden ceiling. He wanted to hate what's been happening. He wanted to bark at his shinobi and his assistant and his brother for what they were doing, taking the prisoners without his permission and treating them like were one of their own. Absurd. Especially since they were that damn Konoha lot who couldn't be trusted no matter how much they preached about peace and unity and teamwork. Scoffed. Teamwork. Unity. Tell that to the Uchiha and the Senju that built up that village starting from a single plank, but could never again come together for that peace. The prisoners should already be dead. They were forcefully sealed. He swallowed a grimace and shoved off the sympathy that crawled over his shoulders, and squeezed dry of anything useful. He was going to have the Aburame killed first, but C had snatched him up and thrust him into Sirius Central Hospital hoping for a cure for the overworked medics and, well, it worked. I was hesitant to admit it, but the boy was sufficiently trained and had once sewn up a patient with a pack of floss and a Senbon when his chakra was no longer at his disposal, both intriguing the other medics and giving C a heart attack at the crude, effective method of surgery. And that wasn't even mentioning the reports he'd been receiving from the SEALs division had been filled with glowing praise for the kid prodigy Kiba from the same border town as Sirius new medic that Mabui brought along, who never followed the rules of step-by-step SEAL solving and rattled off the most bizarre theories that he gestured with fanged grins and poster-sized papers filled with his evidence. Akamaru is such a great addition to the team too, a SEALs decryptor once wrote, like a mascot, almost. I think the stress levels in the department have gone down having him come along. Then came the whispers of Killer Bee's new sparring partner. A Sakura with pink hair that could match him blow for blow and always got back up even after accidentally getting tossed off one of the village's sparring plateaus. Rumor has it that she'd climbed all the way back up with her 1 arm and 2 feet until she'd hauled herself to the top 3 hours later, sweat blinding her eyes and her fist held up to keep fighting. He wanted to hate them. Wanted them locked back where no one knew who they were and regarded like the enemies they should be. He raised his head back up and watched some of the citizens hanging around the bridges as he leaned forward against his thighs. He wanted to hate them, but he remembered Kumogakure was built by the hands of runaways taken in by wandering monks until they were old enough to wander themselves. With no one to meet and nowhere for home, they walked until they found an abandoned shrine at the base of a mountain and built up. And since then, they welcomed all with no family and no place and promised to have all of that in the clouds, in Kumogakure. He sighed. Or at least, it was how the legend went and why most of the Kumar never had a surname. I saw heads of all colors, skins of all colors, backgrounds of all colors traversing the streets and sharing laughs and words like they've never known what it meant to be a stranger. It had been 5 months since 3 kids and a nin dog had been captured on the borders of Lightning Country with the headbands of a village that never came for them stuffed deep at the bottom of one of their bags. I stood and dug out an execution form from one of the cabinets. There was no date or official stamp, but the names had been printed on a long time ago. Inuzuka Kiba, Akamaru, Aburame Shino, Sakura, of Konohagakure. He crumpled the paper in one hand and let it roll into the trash. I wanted to hate them, but he didn't. Azumo diligently sorted through an entire binder of cleared mission reports to store down in the archives. Kotetsu had managed to skip out of this particular job, much to his grumpy displeasure, but his partner promised to get them take out from that soba stall on the other side of town and he couldn't find it in himself to complain too much. Some of the missions and reports weren't too bad to read through and the grumbling ones from the shinobi attending D ranks got a little snort out of him every now and again. Genin complaining about getting cats out of trees. Precious. The last report he had was stuffed in a slim folder with no note on the tab, so he flipped it open to check the date and ranking. He stopped at the sight of the face of Kotetsu's student staring blankly at him, a red Mia stamped across her picture. The next page, Sum's son. Mia, his nin dog partner. Mia. Next page, Shibi's heir. Mia. At the ends of their profiles, presumed deceased. Shit, he whispered in the dim light of the archives. He could already see the look on Kotetsu's face when he hears the news, the red-rimmed eyes and the slack jaw and the way he'll disappear for a few days when he finds out that. Azumo snapped the folder shut and drew in a deep breath and morbidly, he thought. Unlucky 8, huh, so if you're not, like, a seal psi person, how come you knew I was good at it? Kiba drew his spoon through a bowl of dark red stew and took in some light-colored meat, a kinda jello cube, and a potato all at once. The spice hit him as quick as the heat and he swallowed without chewing as his mouth set aflame. What the is that? He whispered. Across from him, Mabui chuckled into her hand before taking a sip of her own meal. She didn't share the same visceral reaction and continued to eat like the devil themself wasn't in her food. I will admit that Tragapan blood stew is an acquired taste, but it's one of our milder dishes. Akamaru woofed around the yak bone he was gnawing on and lolled his tongue when his partner glared through watering eyes. Take some butter tea. It will help. Kiba downed the cup in one gulp and hung his tongue out his mouth, hoping the frost of Kumo's air that rolled in every time someone opened the front door could chill his taste buds, and Mabui took a moment to mull over the past few months. She had to give Kiba a whole new set of clothes when she let him out of the cell because the plain clothes could have the potential to be too telling, so she'd taken some liberties with his style. The standard issue black pants stayed, but she'd pilfered through her apartment and her brother's old clothes for some outgrown mesh shirts and a couple of black track jackets with a white stripe down the middle of the back and around the elbows. Those ones ran a little big, but she figured he would grow into them. Long-term planning and all that. The thing she was most mindful of, though, were the metal bands and brown tattoos on his person that would instantly announce his status. She had him wrap his ankles and forearms with bandages colored the signature Kumogakure red and told him never to leave his cell without them. Only when he agreed did she have him keep several rolls for convenience. But to answer your question, even though I didn't understand much of what you'd written on the walls, I understood enough that it belonged in advanced theory, she said. She tore a piece of flatbread and dipped it into her stew. Tell me, Kiba-kun, what led you to study seals? He bent over his bowl and slowly dug out another piece of meat, careful to get as little soup as possible. I wanted to know how to reverse seals. A pang rattled just behind Mabui's rib cage. Those seals, it nearly slipped to the back of her mind. After they'd been brought in from the border and examined by a seals expert sworn to secrecy, they'd confirmed the seal worked to fall under the cursed category due to its manipulation of body, mind, and will, and had also confirmed its unwilling application by the apparent stress marks amongst the black lines. It sickened her to her stomach to hear of such a thing. The Kumar developed their sealing techniques through skin once a long time ago, but the move to paper mediums came because of the permanent, detrimental effects that were consequent with their use. Some of the older generations who still live with them were blind or deaf or had lost all movement in one arm or the other, or their skin on a leg had been burned so thoroughly even if the clear ink of the seal still remained. Or maybe they couldn't remember their own name longer than a day but could recite their favorite book cover, notation and all. Those who currently utilize powerful skin seal knew of the risks they took. But nowadays, there were so few. I ended up getting really into it, he continued. Turns out I'm pretty good at it. Sakura and Shino thought I could do a lot with it and I have a teach, back in my old village. Or, had. Akamaru set his head atop the hand his partner rested on his lap. Kiba cleared his throat and quickly fished for a jelly cube thing. Jelly cube. Oh, it was blood. Definitely congealed blood. But it's still cool. Am I allowed to look at the sealing books in your library? I don't think it would be too difficult to grant you restricted access to the lenticular library circuit. Lenti, Mabui-san, he whined. That's not a word. She covered her mouth as another laugh spilled past her lips. As she brushed a few strands of her hair behind an ear, she glanced out the window of the small restaurant they were tucked away in. The warm rays of an afternoon had lessened and stars began to speckle the sky. It's getting quite late. I'll have to return to Raikage-sama's office soon to prepare tomorrow's schedule. Okay. He nodded. He tipped his head side to side, wondering if he should take another sip of the demon stew before he left. Thanks for bringing us, Mabui-san. We've never had Kumo food before and Akamaru really likes the yak and bison legs. You're welcome, she smiled. As they stood to gather their bearings and venture out into the crisp air of her beloved village, a solemn feeling weighed down her bones and down to the soles of her feet as they walked the path to Katatumbo Penitentiary, then eventually some back roads so no one knew where they would end up. It was times like these she forgot Kiba was a prisoner. She forgot he wasn't a surname-less boy with a genius for seals and their theories, that he hadn't come to learn from the capital of the country like his village mates Shino the medic hopeful or Sakura the one-handed sword. She forgot that he hadn't been born on the borders, none of them, and that they were actually a product of one of their greatest enemies. But, some part of her murmured, an enemy that sealed their own and left them for dead. Hey Mabui-san, I got a question. She glanced down at him. His face screwed up. What's a tragapan? They're a type of pheasant, and the ones served in that restaurant those native to this part of Lightning. Pheasants. What? Like, pretty chickens. She pressed her hand to her mouth again to smother her laughter. I suppose you can call them that, she agreed. And when he grinned, she couldn't help but think how Konoha didn't deserve a boy like him. Ah, what a shame. Naruto's ears perked up and turned to the sound of the voice. His hands dripped with the frigid water of the stream that rushed a step away from where he knelt, and he wiped his face dry on his jacket sleeve and pushed himself up to his feet. Jiraiya sat at the base of a tree with a pen between his teeth and his nose deep in one of his brainstorming notebooks. Didja say something, Ero Senin? Just trying to figure out how to write this part and, what do you think about me adding a bit where my beautiful heroine gets a white letter then the kick is we don't know who it's from and bam. Cliffhanger. He exclaimed. Naruto rolled his eyes and shook the water from his hands. How about that? I don't even know what a white letter is. Huh, you don't. Jiraiya set down his notebook and squinted at his student. Aren't they supposed to teach you that kinda stuff at the academy? Well, they didn't, the boy sniffed. He didn't actually remember if they talked about whatever those letters were or not with all the times he didn't pay attention, which was always, but there was no way he was gonna admit something like that. What's a white letter? So, the Sannin beckoned Naruto closer until he plopped on the ground in front of him, legs crossed and eyes wide. Let's say you go on a mission that's high risk. When you gain rank and experience, you'll learn to distinguish the dangerous ones and the dangerous ones you might not come out of. That's when you write your last words in letters for important people who maybe won't see you again. It's morbid, but hey, we signed up for this. Can't say we didn't know the risks, right? Something familiar nudged at the back of Naruto's head. You take those letters, seal them all up in white envelopes, and write who they're for on the back in black ink. After that, the person takes every letter they've got and leaves it with a trusted person in the village to distribute if they really don't make it back. But on the chance they do, that trusted person hands it back to them. Jiraiya rolled his shoulders. It's mostly Junin who take up the practice, but depending on the mission, you never know, you know. Naruto reached for his gray backpack and threw the front flap open. He dug through old clothes and weapon wax and clumpy wire and ramen packs until he reached the bundle of envelopes he tucked in a clear plastic baggie so he wouldn't get them all dirty. The Uehi Kurenai on the back on the top envelope was written clear as day. Did Sakura-chan really give him? Yuto. Oi, brat. His head snapped up. Huh. Jiraiya frowned, concern pulling at his laugh lines as he watched the boy wrap his arms around his pack and pulled it close to his chest. Did someone leave you white letters? He shook his head so hard the Sannin thought that if he kept it up a little longer it might have popped right off his neck, but Jiraiya could always pluck a lie out of a sea of truths and half-truths. Being trusted with white letters wasn't a bad thing, per se, but knowing Naruto and the scant friends he had, he was curious as to just who in the village had trusted this boy enough to leave something as delicate as a last will and testimony. Look, it's okay if you got some, but it was probably a bad idea to bring them along if I'm training you out of country for who knows how long. They're not white letters, Naruto declared firmly. His lips pressed together and his eyes hardened in a way Jiraiya hadn't quite seen before. She just asked me to keep them. It's a mission that's supposed to last, like, 9 months or something. Nothing bad's gonna happen and, she's probably back in Konoha right now. You'll see. Heart heavy, Jiraiya opened his mouth to try and explain that no, it wasn't good for us to think like that, because the more you push it away the harder it pushed back and sometimes your friends don't make it back, but Naruto was up on his feet with an excuse of hunger on the tip of his tongue as he escaped further downstream to catch a couple of fish. He leaned back into the tree and sighed. You'll learn one day, kid. He thought of Minato and Kushina, faces from his academy years that he never saw again, all the missed opportunities and all the people he'd ever failed. Sometimes, things just don't work out the way you want. An image of Uchiha Sasuke flashed in his mind's eye, as well as the scratched Hittite he left behind with his unconscious student at the Valley of the End. But still, I wish the world was kinder to you, Naruto. Darui heard of the way too rowdy kid that joined the SEAL sector. Or maybe, joined, was a strong word. It was more like a kid showed up with Mabui one day and solved a SEAL array by taping pieces of it to the ceiling because, looking up wasn't the same as looking down. Then he found out who the kid was. Then, understandably, he made sure he wasn't daydreaming and gently pulled Mabui aside and asked, quite politely, what was going on. It's complicated. Can you uncomplicate it? Kiba-kun, Mabui trailed off, searching for words in the walls with how fast her eyes shifted from spot to spot. It caught Darui's attention instantly, because of everything she was as the boss's dutiful assistant, indecisive wasn't one of them. He's a nice boy, she finished lamely. A nice boy, he parroted, tone as dry as the sand dunes he once scaled in the Wind Country provinces. The prisoner. Shish. Her hands latched around his bicep as they stood just outside the SEAL Division workspace. The room hummed with the buzz of Kiba and the workers elbow deep in a particularly tricky 10-layer seal, and it was only the two of them who'd stepped out into the hall, but Mabui wasn't one to take chances and Darui had known her long enough to pick out the quiet panic in her face. The SEAL's division doesn't know. The only ones who do are the assigned guards, C-san, B-sama, and I, she said. His eyebrow at the mention of his partner. And along with Kiba-kun came Shino-san and Sakura-san. They're his village mates from the border town near Turtle Island. Surely you've heard of them. All of the prisoners had been let out of their cells and had backstories to cover up their true identities. Boss once mentioned to him in passing that the circumstances around the Konoha prisoners had changed, but he figured it was nothing big, maybe a shifting of placement or a hold on an execution date, so he'd let it be and kept his nose out of that business. Apparently that was a mistake. And look where it left him. He exhaled through his nose and shuffled a bit to the side to peek through the glass window of the door. Kiba hovered over one of the tables with one hand holding a brush and the other gesturing just as wildly as the rest of him as he and another technician tossed ideas back and forth. His eyes were bright and every time he opened his mouth there was a flash of sharp fangs, but he looked every part of an eager kid that talked about the latest cliffside he scaled or the new high score he made at the arcade. It was strange to see the cheer directed at SEALs, though. He turned back to Mabui and her anxious face and exhaled again. Okay, sorry. So, Kiba, he said. He hasn't tried to make an escape. Nothing turns up missing from the offices. Not at all. Perhaps we believed them to be lying at the start, but, she frowned, as per protocol for most established shinobi nations, if a shinobi doesn't report back to their village within 3 months of their return date an investigation is launched. If the investigation yields no results in the month after that, then the case files are more often than not marked Mia or Kia and left on a casual watch list. They both peered back through the window, catching Kiba's laugh as the dog set his paws on the table and wagged his tail. We captured them in October, Darui-san. It's been 6 months since then. If anyone had been looking for them, they aren't anymore. He knew no one was looking for them, but hearing it out loud left a bitter taste on his tongue. Darui couldn't imagine what his life would have been like if he didn't have Kumo at his back. A village was only as good as the people that filled it, and since he would never allow his loyalty to Boss waver nor let himself turn his back on his friends, his comrades, his family, he couldn't even fathom waking alone in a cell after being left to die in the lightning wilderness. He remembered the day they'd brought in the team. Chunin level at the highest, attacker unknown, their near unconscious bodies waiting for the border patrol like a bleeding, barely breathing gift. There were teeth marks in the Inuzuka's shoulder that sunk deep through the bone made by something like a tiger or a lion, but most likely one of those leopards that roamed the country, and a kunai stuck through each thigh. When Boss demanded more details of the scene, they said the boy had red eyes from tears and they could hear him screaming himself hoarse minutes before they got there. He didn't think the circumstances would ever be clear to him with as little as anyone from the team wanted to talk about the incident. The other information they wanted they couldn't even ask with those disgusting seals on their tongues. Darui rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. Of all the lost kids Kumo opened their arms to, why did the next bunch have to be Kanahans? Something cracked up his spine and through the muscles in his throat. He and Mabui burst into the SEAL Division workspace, him with a hand on the hilt of his cleaver sword and her armed with a handful of kunai she hid in the sleeves of her blazer. All Darui saw was the explosion that left his ears ringing and that the Inuzuka, Kiba, pushed a SEAL's technician to the ground as the brunt of the blast sent him crashing through the tables behind him, one ear bleeding and his nin dog partner diving towards the rigged SEAL to pull it further away from the rest of the people in the room. The 10-layered seal they were trying to unlock had fail-safes buried in the matrices, one of which had been an explosive tag masked under a sequence that Kiba and SEAL's technician Yatsuki Kyoi of the Yatsuki clan, one of the ridiculously few clans under Kumogakure, had accidentally overlooked when scanning the setup for openings to break. But that wasn't what snagged Darui's attention and dragged him back to the workroom the very next morning. It was that the Chunin, the boy, the Kanahan, Kiba, shoved Yatsuki away so he wouldn't get hit with the blast. 70% hearing loss in his right ear, C told them after assessing the damage and healing to the best of his ability. Yatsuki-san would have had it worse had he not avoided the explosion. How was that managed, by the way? Darui's gaze swept over the now clean division, empty for all except himself and the unsolved seal locked up tight at the other end of the room. Kiba didn't have to save Yatsuki. He had no obligation, no ties, no camaraderie for his enemy shinobi. And really, it probably would have benefited him more if he hadn't pushed Yatsuki out the way, because even one down Kumo Nin was a victory for the hopeless. Kumogakure was the Kanahan's enemy, his chains, his warden. And yet, he's a nice boy. Well, maybe, nice, wasn't the best word for it. The clack of an opening door sounded behind him and he turned, expecting another inspection crew to gauge the room and take a look at the scroll responsible for the damage. It wasn't an inspection crew. It was Kiba who stepped in with his nin dog hovering around his knees and 2 ink tags hanging off metal chains looped through his earlobes. He blinked when he met Darui's eyes, which were a little wider than his usual half-lidded stare, and scratched the back of his head with a sheepish grin. Mabui-san said I was probably gonna have the room to myself since the team's gonna be out the rest of the week, he said in a way of greeting. Sorry if you didn't think I was comin'. Do you want me to go, sir, or? Darui, and it's fine, sorry I'm in your way, Darui said. He glanced over at the boy, noting nothing much different save for the fashion statement dangling from his ears and the few bandages stuck on the visible spots of skin. What are you doing out? Thought you'd want to recover after yesterday. Oh yeah, but I'm good now. Darui blinked. As Kiba stood there with a sheepish grin and his hands in the pockets of his track jacket, he thought of the horde of broken stables stacked just outside near the trash bins and the blood that stained the splintered bits. You're a prisoner, not a Kumo Nin, he stated bluntly. Kiba flinched minutely and Akamaru's tail droops. No one's forcing you to buck up until there's someone that does. You just turned mostly deaf in one ear. Why think that's gonna stop me? The boy huffed. His eyes narrowed, feral at the edges as something stone cold spiked out from the dark depths of his pupils. Darui's bored expression morphed minutely at the sight, a sight far different from the rowdy troublemaker he saw just the day before. This one was wild. I got banged up in that explosion, so what? I fixed it. He jabbed a thumb at the tag swinging near his face. Diffusion and amplification seals. Shino told me about hearing aids once and it's like the same thing, just for shinobi. Akamaru woofed lowly and pointed his snout towards the lock box, and his partner looked down. Oh, right. And just like that, the darkness in his eyes was gone and the fanged grin touches back on his face. Darui could have gotten whiplash with how quick those emotions had come and gone, how they swirled in a way that he wasn't quite sure that even Kiba knew that he'd done it. Was it from his time in the cells or something before that? Darui wondered. Heard they locked up that seal after it went off on us, Kiba said, ambling towards the metal safe in the corner of the room. You have the key. I wanna take another stab at it, if that's cool. The drive to work on the very thing that nearly killed him less than 24 hours ago startled Darui again, and this time he was getting annoyed by all these surprises. A prisoner was all this boy was. A young, abandoned, genius prisoner that Konoha let slip through their self-righteous fingers. He was starting to see why Mabui liked him so much. He nodded once. Sure. Darui twisted the safe lock as both Kiba and Akamaru glanced away to leave the combination out of their hands. Honestly, what was that? The kid was out of his mind and carefully set down the seal configuration on the closest unbroken table. Kiba lit up immediately and unfurled the thick scroll until it spanned the length of his workspace as Akamaru curled into a ball close to his feet, head on his front paws and his eyes half-lidded as they never strayed from his partner. Loyal, the Kumo Junin mused to himself as he plopped on a wooden stool opposite the boy. Elbows propped on the table and his chin in his hand, Darui watched as Kiba dipped a brush ink in a newly opened bottle of ink and flew through matrices and sequences like he was born to do it. It was intriguing to watch him work, honestly. Darui was never one for seals despite how integral of a part it had in Kumogakure's foundations. Every careful stroke of black and every messy scribble on scratch paper felt like standing in the middle of an art museum when you knew nothing about art, frankly confusing but entertaining all the same. About 30 minutes into the comfortable silence, Kiba spoke. Darui-san, is it true that Sakura's the sparring partner for this dude named Killer Bee? If she's that pink-haired girl who's always with him, then yeah, he affirmed. He wasn't too sure of the name, but he'd caught a glimpse of the nin with one arm missing and the other clad in white bandages and a vambrace of blue-dyed yak hide most definitely meant to cover her prisoner identification. So she's okay. The genuine worry in Kiba's face hurt a bit to look at. If he remembered correctly, the Konohans had all been separated since the moment of capture and hadn't seen each other since. Okay enough that she can keep up with Bee-sama. Which was a trip in itself to find out. No one could keep up with Killer Bee, not with his eccentricities, not with whatever caught his attention next, and definitely not with the stamina he never seemed to run out of. But from the whispers that sometimes floated by him, the girl tried, and by God she tried. He told Kiba about the one-armed cliff climbing, the taijutsu spars that were said to last for hours, the way she apparently just didn't stop even though it was clear that she needed to. And Kiba just laughed, his eyes flashing with a watery shine. She's always been like that, you know, he grinned. And Mabui-san told me about Shino too, that he's working at the hospital and stuff and it's good. That they're both okay. He glanced back at the place his and his team's sealed scrolls were kept, unbroken, and his grin fell off his face. Shino has a medical inventory book he likes to keep track of and there's a sword Sakura like to use. Can you get those to them? They'd really like it, please. Darui stared blankly, blinked, and dropped his chin back into his hand. If he noticed the boy's eyes had grown even shinier, he didn't say anything about it. I'll do what I can. Shino and Sakura get their things within the week. But he didn't tell Kiba that. April howls softly at the moon. It had always been on Sakura's agenda that she learn one-handed seals. It would have been more practical that way, with one hand molding chakra for jutsu while the other held a kunai or sword to deflect any bodies or projectiles that got in her way. But then the Colosseum happened, incident number 2. She wasn't looking forward to whatever incident number 3 would have in store for them. Third time's a charm was the saying, but unlucky 8 was never unlucky on a whim. Sakura swallowed down a few gulps of some energy drink brand they didn't have in Konoha and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, some of her pink hair falling into her eyes. She knew her chakra control was better than others. It had to be. She never had monstrous reserves like her father, and no matter how much she trained, it was still one of the genes that never lent its favor. But since her realization of it years ago, there were certainly jutsu she knew could make up for what she lacked. Luckily for her, she'd seen a prime example of one over and over again when she was still in AIM. And once she mastered it, she would have to thank Kakuzu-san if she ever saw him again. There was a tap on her shoulder and she turned her head only for a finger to poke her cheek as raucous laughter filled her ears. She blinked. Break's over, B-sama. Ah, you're so cold, I don't think I've ever seen you pop a grin, he sighed, dropping onto the rock beside her. He knocked her knee with his and pushed up his sunglasses with a knuckle. But we can take a longer break, give a rest to those bruises on your shins. Sakura glanced down at her pants, which had ripped off from her bandaged ankles, and pulled up the cloth to the sight of mottled red, black, and blue. The mountains here weren't particularly soft, she thought dryly, and she'd scraped her legs against them every time she tried to dodge a hit by going low. Shino would have a stroke if he found out she wasn't. A shudder knocks into her chest and her heart squeezed. 7 months. That was how long it had been since she'd seen Shino's hands flare green and Kiba's face smudged in black ink and Akamaru with his tongue lolled out after a long run. She remembered each of their faces like she saw them just yesterday, but it was only in her luck that the last thing she could recall were Shino's and Akamaru's prone bodies and Kiba screaming to the heavens that wouldn't listen. 7 months. They probably looked a lot different now. Her cheek got poked again. She turned her head to the other side. Yes. What's got ya? Thinkin' way over there? B asked. You've got that 1,000-yard stare. I swear, I don't know where's your care. Sakura set her drink by her katana. I'd like to see my team, but under my circumstances, I know it's not possible. B's face was unreadable, as always, and she swore she'd learned to read the crinkles around his eyes. They're alive, though, and as long as they are, I won't have trouble waiting to see them again. What she didn't say was that even if it took 1,000,000 years, she would wait, because from her skin to her muscle to her bone to her core, she knew it was her fault they were here in the first place. If she hadn't been so different, they wouldn't have tipped the dominoes that landed them on Shimura Danzo's hit list. If they hadn't met her, they'd be better off. She knew that. But she was selfish. She loved them and she didn't want to let them go. She didn't know what she'd do if she lost someone like that again. Her father was already enough. B was quiet and contemplating, like how he usually was half the time, like he was having another conversation with someone else, somewhere else. Almost a minute later he came back to himself, a tilt to his lips as he rubbed the underside of his chin. Tell me something, he said. He stuck one of his swords into the dirt and leaned against the hilt. Sakura frowned. What a way to treat a decent blade. What was it like at that Colosseum? She was instantly reminded of the stale scent of settled dust and weeks-old blood. Screams rang faintly in her ears and she can pinpoint the exact feeling of freshly sharpened axe cut through flesh and bone as she saved the one person she shouldn't have. She felt a sharp sting in her left arm just where her wrist would have been, and she looked down. Still, nothing. Just bandaged right at the bend of her elbow. Think of it as dog fighting for bets. Except the dogs are anyone they could kidnap and collar, and the ones making bets are the corrupt rich. She tore her eyes away from her arm and fixed her gaze at a spot far off in the distance. But it wasn't the worst. It was training with consequences. I didn't have to like it to know that it helped. Help. Help with what? B was starting to put the pieces together. Ever since he'd chanced upon her at Catatumbo, there had always been something off. He noticed. You noticed. And he was sure C and Mabui and Enmu and noticed if her and her team had yet to have their bodies burned and their ashes sealed into the earth. The girl was young, but she wasn't stupid, and she fought nothing like those Konahans with their moral high ground and subpar kenjutsu skills. And, sometimes, when they walked through the village, he'd get snubbed by the older Kumar as usual. Sakura never asked or treated him differently when she saw, but once when someone made an offhanded muttering about her hanging around the wrong sort, she'd simply blinked, turned, and said, "The only wrong sort I see is somebody who can't mind their own business. Look me in the eyes and say that again." B had snorted into his hand when the passing citizen paled and quickened their pace down the street, and Yuki had sat quiet and pensive as the girl, blank-faced and cold, turned back around and continued her walk, the scars on her shoulder flashing from under her shirt. She was someone he wanted to get to the bottom of because, well, he liked the kid. Prisoner or not. You're an idiot. What's up with you cramping my style, you? Go make some friends, maybe you'll find out something new. Make friends while trapped in your thick head. I could always introduce ya to Sak. Pass. B huffed quietly and asked Sakura about the Colosseum. Her answer wasn't quite what he expected. But it wasn't the worst, she said. It was training with consequences. I didn't have to like it to know that it helped. Some of that iciness trailed back into her face. She wasn't much of an expressive person to begin with, but he was starting to think that her chill wasn't as innate as he first thought. But Gyu's interest piqued at her words. Neither of them would describe a kill or be killed situation as a training experience, much less one that made for a lot of learning opportunities. And how many training opportunities did Ya get? That Ya managed to work a sweat. The look she gave him said that she could see his question for what it was, her kill count, but she answered with another beat. 124 during the rounds. 20 during our escape. 144 in all. B opened his mouth, a frown in the corners of his mouth and a question bursting on his tongue, but then there was the telltale tingle at the back of his neck as Gyu's warm, heavy chakra washed over him. Pale pink pupil-less irises melted over the whites of his eyes behind his dark lenses, and he straightened in his seat. 144, Yuki's voice drawled from B's mouth. Sakura's eyes narrowed slightly, but other than that she offered no other movement. Even he had to nod to the small part of him that found it so damn interesting. Why did you think it was necessary to keep count? It's important to keep a track record, she answered. Keep yourself in check because no one else will. And for your team, 118 for Shino, 116 for Kiba. It didn't skip his notice that the number of her kills exceed the other two by a substantial margin. Yuki might not completely understand how humans worked or why they thought pitting themselves against one another could ever be fun, but he was sure an institution like the Colosseum could only work on a system that its victims had to follow to a T. So what are you saying? It's not like you to find something dismayin'. Yuki didn't get to reply to his curious host, because the girl at his side shifted to face him better and bent down into a short, polite bow. I haven't introduced myself, but you've probably seen me through B-sama, she said. I'm Sakura. It's nice to meet you. There wasn't an ounce of fear in the slope of her shoulders, and her tone was as bold and genuine as it had been when B found her pushing herself to fatigue in one of Katatumbo's empty concrete cells. The first thing he realized was that she knew he was a tailed beast. The second thing he realized was that even when the scars on her shoulder had been caused by one of his siblings, she didn't treat him any differently than she treated B. It's nice, isn't it? B remarked gently, his voice a soft brush against the back of the head. To get treated like you ain't some outcast misfit. Quote. Call me Hachibi. And he relinquished control back to his host, receding back to the open space of his seal. He said nothing for the rest of the day, his mind too filled with thoughts of weird little Amex and their mannerisms. He was going to lose his mind, he just knew it. Motoi stared at the pink-haired kid standing in front of him, a katana slung across her back and probably the blankest expression he'd ever seen on anyone across her face. He hoped she didn't notice how much he was losing his shit on the inside, but yeah, in all the years he'd been stationed as head supervisor on Genbu, the Turtle Island, he'd never had someone just show up. Maybe she was lost. Yes, lost. Just happened to wander onto Kumo's sentient training ground that was literally an enormous turtle that floated around the coast as she pleased. I don't think I'm supposed to be here, were the first words that came between the two of them, and Motoi's face slowly dropped into his hands. I see, he sighed. He inhaled deeply before he rubbed the dark green tattoo over the bridge of his nose. Well, you're here now, so I suppose there's no harm in registering you. The barriers signaled another body upon arrival, though, may I have your names and villages of residence? Sakura. No surname. I was originally from Imbula, but I've been staying in Kumo to improve my kenjutsu, she replied. Imbula. The border town close to the south coasts? He questioned. At her nod, he hummed and tucked the information at the back of his head. Imbula. The rain village, no correlation with Amegakure, the village hidden in the rain. Alright, your companion, then. Killer B-sama. I've heard that all the Kumo nin know him. Motoi's back went rigid, but he hid it as best he could as he pulled a small notebook from his vest to flip through his notes and prior registries. Of course Killer B had to catch him off guard with a visit today, the one person he could never look in the eye that brought along a strange kid that wouldn't break eye contact if he wasn't the one to do it first. But karma hated him anyways, so he might as well go with it. I don't know if B-sama's told you, but he's made friends with every animal on the island including Genbu herself, and with every visit he takes the time to greet most of them, if not all. Quote. Ah. You could do as you please here, really, as long as you're not harming any of the inhabitants or causing intentional damage. Which you're not going to do, are you? She quirked a brow. Not that I planned. He narrowed his eyes. I'll take your word for that. Against my better judgment. He shook his head. But if you're going to wait for B-sama, I suggest training at one of the many available fields except field number 6, or find something to keep you otherwise occupied for the hours you're probably going to spend here. I'll train then, Sakura said. Field 6, that's the 1-2 to the left from the entrance, right? Yes. Motoi blinked. Wait, how did you know that? He knew the field numbers by heart from all the years he'd worked here, but the numbered posts had all been taken down some days ago and the new replacements had yet to be repainted. It's the only one with a genjutsu over it. How long did it take for you to see it? A minute or so. It caught my attention when I was walking towards you. Her blank eyes twisted with calculation as she squinted. Why? Why? Because it shouldn't have taken a measly minute for one of his genjutsu to get noticed, especially when the purpose of the one over field 6 was to direct people's attention away from it without realizing their attention was being forced elsewhere. Normally it would catch a shinobi's eye if they'd been on the island long enough to figure something wasn't quite right, but this girl comes in and does it immediately. On the first visit. You're a genjutsu type, he noted with surprise. Her brows furrowed. Oh, were you not aware? Only genjutsu types could have seen through an illusion like that so quickly. I might have noticed something once, she replied. She remembered holding her father's hand in a cemetery and seeing trees that looked so wrong in her eyes before a kunai came from them and clipped her arm. But I never got trained in it. And that was odd, because her talent for it, from what he'd seen, could be curbed into something extraordinary. Did you ever want to learn? He tucked his notebook back into his vest and took a seat on the trunk of a felled tree. Sakura eyed him warily, but took the open invitation and sat a step or two away with only the slightest hesitation. I guess it was something I never got to focus on. Are you interested in learning? Are you offering to teach? She shot back. Motoi leaned back with a hum. Her defensiveness shouldn't surprise him. Here he was, a complete stranger trying to pry into the history of her skills and talents. She had every right to be worried and didn't seem used to the Kuma way of scooping up the worst to make them the best, and scooping up the best to make them better. When he thought about it, he supposed teaching wouldn't be so bad. With all the time he'd spent on Genbu passing the years with only animals and short visits from other Kumo shinobi as company, it got a little lonely from time to time. He was lucky he usually preferred the quiet and the solitude and the sound of rolling waves that pushed against Genbu's great sides. But, teaching wouldn't be too bad. I suppose I am, he answered honestly, lips tipping up at the first time the girl broke her expressionless mask by letting her eyes grow a fraction. They quickly snapped back to a glare, though, as her own arm shifted closer to the katana at her hip. What's in it for you? I'll get my first student to continue on what I know. That's a good enough reason to want to take you under my wing, isn't it? He shrugged. But it's your choice. I'm just a Junin who's only getting older. Her stance didn't lighten and her hand continued to hover over the hilt of her blade, and if she kept looking into his eyes she would see the way dark depths sparked in approval. He didn't have to ask her to prove herself, he didn't need to fight her to make her show her resilience. In the way she never let up, the way she persevered with everything she must have lost. It was proof enough for him that she must already be someone exemplary. Eventually, Sakura lowered herself into a slight bow. I would be pleased to take you up on your offer. Motoi. He clapped her shoulder a few times to get her to straighten up. Nice to meet your acquaintance, Sakura-san. Not too far away, B smiled to himself as he scaled a tree to watch a number of Himalayan jumping spiders crawl around the branches. But May was never kind. The hospital was stressful. There were medics rushing the halls, nurses filling out paperwork, beeps and clunks and clicks sounding off in the building that would never hush. It was bustling, it was frantic, it was chaos. And Shino loved it. He didn't know exactly when the idleness started on him like an itch he couldn't scratch, but he noticed how quick irritation started to settle if he wasn't reading or writing or sewing strands of muscle together. His Kikai felt the same way too, and Shino managed to convince C to at least let his colony flit around the vents and blame the noise on the air conditioning. He stopped by a window in the hall, one hand in his white coat pocket and the other holding open the file he's in the middle of reading. The skies aren't the same deep blue like in Konoha and much of it was drowned out by the clouds. Everything was paler and the sun didn't feel quite as yellow. And even though nothing was the same, the village was like a breath of fresh air in his lungs. Shino-sensei. A nurse called ahead of him. C-sensei requires your assistance in emergency room 3. On my way, he returned. As he hurried toward the stairs and made his way down to the first floor, he paper-clipped the page he left off and set it on the administration desk before he slipped into the emergency room. He pulled on a pair of gloves from the rack on the wall and tugged them on as he shut the door behind him and approached the burned, unconscious body on the bed. Odd that it's only C and him there, and there were no nurses checking vitals. Training injury. Field mission, C corrected. Shino assesses the angry red burns that curled, leaving no centimeter unscathed with the sheer amount of top skin layer that had been singed right off. He brushed some of the stray blonde hair that was soaking up blood from the wounds. He'd seen those burns before. Tailed beast chakra, he recognized. C flinched, his head shooting up. It causes permanent disfigurement no matter how severe the injury and requires immediate attention to address possible internal damage. How did you? I've treated it before. An image of Sakura's dim apartment flashed behind his eye and there was a phantom feeling of blood on his fingers, sweat on his brow, and a tunneling vision from the sight of burnt cloth buried in weeping gashes. He shook his head and clenched his fists when the threat of tremors started to creep down his arms. There's not much we can do but assure whatever needs to be healed is healed. But when he lowered his head back towards the body, he saw the tips of their patient's fingers slowly but surely knitting itself into a normal skin color. What? This isn't a typical Kumo nin, C started reluctantly, but Shino had already turned his ear away as his brain kicked into overdrive. Chakra burns, self-healing, only him and C attending to the patient, only one viable explanation rose and he supposed it wasn't a stretch. No, because this is a Jinchuriki, he interrupted, and the medic across from him paled. How did I come to this conclusion? Those capable of wielding healing chakra are scarce in Kumo, as you've once told me, and I doubt any of them are capable of such an advanced healing capability that can be utilized in an unconscious state. In fact, the only person who may be able to perform such a feat is Senju Tsunade. He tilted his head, oblivious to the way C tensed. Look, if you have any problem with Jinchuriki, I suggest you. Whatever needs to be done has to be within the short window between time of injury and the end of the healing period, Shino continued, too engrossed in his thought process to have heard anything at all. His hands flared a careful mint green as he hovered one hand over the torso and the other over the heart. 30 minutes is my estimate. He glanced up and frowned. C-sensei. C blinked out his stupor, his hands glowing chakra scalpel blue and a slight smile on the corner of his lips. We need to get the bone shards out of her left arm and right leg before they're completely healed and we have to dig it out ourselves. Remember what I taught you about using chakra as a tool. Stay away from the veins as much as possible. Good. Keep it in mind. Let's get to work. The Jinchuriki's name was Niyugito and she was host to the two-tailed cat. Many looked up to her and her skill and just as many, if not more, feared her all the same. Shino lent an ear to the whispers of his colleagues where he'd learnt just a couple of things. 1. Of all the times she'd come to the hospital, only C and the same one nurse had come to her aid. 2. The longest she'd ever been unconscious without signs of waking was 12 hours, most likely due to the nature of her beast. It had been 24 hours since he'd been called to her healing and she hadn't even twitched. There was something wrong, and Shino was going to figure out what it was. Call it intuition or paranoia, but a sudden change for anything called for suspicion. From all the eavesdropping he'd done on his classmates at the academy to the spying he'd done once he started to carry the Unlucky 8 name, he learned how crucial it was to never count out the stupid or impossible. Underestimation led to downfalls, and downfalls could lead to death. On one of his breaks he entered Yugito's room and flipped through the clipboard hung on the foot of the bed. Because there was no nurse that accompanied him on the clock as per C's orders, just to mind his training, was the excuse, because they couldn't just say a prisoner couldn't wander without supervision, the door was cracked wide open. No change, he muttered to himself. How is there no change? All the medication has been given, all internal and external injuries have been healed. He walked around to the IV bag and took a sample of the solution. A quick glance out the door showed no one passing by, and he wasted no time dropping the sample into a vial of clear liquid he'd produced from his coat. A quick inversion of the container and the mixture remained clear, free of any indicative color. That ruled out sabotage. Then, Shino straightened one of Yugito's pale arms and searched for a vein near the joint of her elbow. He pricked her freshly healed skin and smeared some of her blood on the pad of his thumb. Plucking out the medical inventory book C returned to him 2 months ago, he opened to the back cover where his self-made pocket still held the seal papers Kiba drew up with a jutsu Sakura manufactured one night after dinner. One bloody thumbprint later, the seal brightened and dimmed, but didn't change color either. If nothing's wrong with her blood either, perhaps. His eye drifted towards the door again. Even after running every possible consequence in his head, he shut the door, locked it, and let his kikai swirl around the room. C tapped his pen against his desk as he sat in his office, tens of papers waiting for his signature but his thoughts a million miles away. It was about that time of year again for staff evaluations that would eventually be read over by the Sirius Central Hospital head and then eventually Raikage-sama himself, and rarely was there ever an employee that came out with a poor assessment. Which came to the problem of the newest medic working the rounds. When he picked Shino up from Katatumbo, he was expecting a medic that could at the very least take up the slack and keep the rest of them from shouldering too much work. He thought the hospital would have a new medic to take on simple cases like broken skin and snapped bones, or would take up the duty of going through the routine checkups all shinobi were required to attend to once a year. But what did he end up getting? He got a medic that could pick up a plethora of anomalies 3 minutes after a simple scan, could be as efficient without chakra as he was with chakra, and could correctly identify chakra burns by sight and hold no prejudice for any patient he worked with. And much to his disgruntlement, those things he listed were only the few of many. To put it simply, Shino was brilliant and he had no idea how Konoha let this one go. He frowned. And if the boy had been left to rot in Katatumbo, there would have been nothing left of him but scar tissue and healing hands. A knock on the door resounded, and C straightened. "Come in." A nurse bustles through and set another stack of files by his side. He withheld a sigh. "More evaluations. Got it in one." She smiled pityingly. "This is the last batch of them, if that makes you feel any better." "A bit. Thank you," he said. He clicked the top of his pen before setting it down. "If you're going past the break room, could you get Shino for me? I need to talk to him about some of the upcoming appointments we have later today." "Oh, he's not in there." C could pinpoint the exact moment his blood started to freeze. "What do you mean? I stopped by the break room before coming here and the only one in there was Q-sensei eating his lunch and C-sensei." C was up on his feet before he even got a chance to think and brushed past the nurse with a quick, "Excuse me." His office was on the top of 7 floors and there was an endless amount of units he could check to find the wayward medic. Had I let my guard down? Was he waiting for the perfect moment? He burst through every door he passed and looked through every single viewing window. What was I thinking? Letting him roam and interact with the Kumo citizens. I shouldn't have been so desperate. I shouldn't have taken the chance. He'd skimmed 3 floors before he was struck with a thought. C shunshin to the 2nd floor, the step-down unit where all patients were under intermediate care, and ran towards recovery room 8. In the plastic pouch on the wall just outside was the file labeled Ni Yugito with her shinobi identification picture of all to see. He grasped the door handle and tried to turn it. It didn't budge. There was a rush in his ears as he tightened his grip and forced it in so hard that his hand went through the door and ripped the locking mechanism from its frame. C barged through the door, and the scene that welcomed him was one that he probably wouldn't forget. Blood streaked out of Yugito's nose and ears as Shino stood by her bedside, black insects on half her face and half of his as he cradled a wriggling mass of white worms in the palms of his hands. There were parasites in her brain, Shino greeted. One of the worms dropped onto the floor and a small team of Kikai swooped down to immobilize it. C's jaw unhinged. "When would you like to conduct further research?" Itachi didn't feel it was right for him to intrude on his partner's space. He was entitled to his own secrets and traditions, and perhaps in this case, his times of mourning the wife and daughter he barely spoke of. Kisame sat in front of a grave, cross-legged and rain pouring over his uncovered head. His cloak was absent as well as Samahata, and the grounds were alight in neon-white depictions of lambs and lions that ran all the way from the gravestones to the brick walls that barred the cemetery. Just like the rest of the art that scattered Omegakure, even these ones had meaning, and they might as well have been the most sentimental of them all. Itachi shifted from his spot beneath an overhang just a ways behind the graveyard gates, just out of his partner's line of sight but his partner perfectly in line with his. Kisame was never a quiet, somber sort of fellow. There was always a friendly air about him despite his pointed teeth and the way his posture screamed for a fight. He joked as he pleased and laughed out loud all the same, but there was never an ounce of disrespect he carried in his huge, muscled body. Every opponent he addressed with the same courtesy as his comrades, and he always upheld his top moral of never killing or harming children. A kind criminal, Itachi thought. Maybe it was a bit oxymoronic and maybe that description won't ever make sense, but at this point he doubted he'd ever meet another person like Hoshigaki Kisame, someone who had no reason to look upon the world with a chuckle and a grin, but did anyways. And, someone who always seemed to remember his favorite types of tea and the off fact that he always liked eating dango in even sticks, never odds. Itachi's brow furrowed. The rain continued its merciless onslaught and he unconsciously tightened his cloak around himself as his breath came out in puffs of faint white. Now that he thought about it, it was Kisame who nagged him to go to his appointments, cooked his favorite meals whenever he happened to be at his apartment, could always manage to find a book at the bookstore that he himself was never interested, but Itachi was always surprised to enjoy. He scoffed lightly and shook his head. It's his kindness, he thought softly, that I always seem to be taking advantage of. He's visiting his daughter today, it seems. Konan appeared beside him, aloof and as chilled as the air around them, with her arms crossed over her middle and not a single drop of rain on her skin. Itachi tilted his head. You know of his daughter. I used to look after her whenever Kisame-san was away, she said. She glanced at him briefly before her gaze flickered back to the cemetery. I understand your confusion. It's hard for him to speak of her even after all this time. Itachi didn't blame Kisame. He can't. How could he, when even at night when he was all alone and his parents' names refused to leave his lips without a burning in his throat and tears swelling just behind his eyes? He regretted and regretted and regretted and regretted, and when he looked at Kisame it was almost like he never did. He lost everything, they both had, but for Kisame it was never his own fault. That was the difference between them. Because Kisame was a good man. And I'm not. I believe it was best for the two of you to be partners, Konan said. It's good for you. The both of you. Itachi turned back to ask what she meant, but there was nothing beside him but the cold and the rain. I heard you were the one that saved my life. Niyugito leaned against the entryway of Greenhouse 5 and watched as a boy spun around in his chair, his sample left in the microscope and his goggle glasses hanging around his neck. She noticed how his right eye shined and didn't move in tune with the other, but before she could observe further, his gloves were peeled off and in the nearby trash can and he was readjusting the glasses over his face. My, it turns out the boy is as interesting as C-san made him sound. I noticed the parasites, he replied. He stood to smooth the wrinkles in his coat and extended his hand. Shino, it's good to see you've made a full recovery, Ni-san. She took his hand and gave a firm shake and a friendly smile. You dug around my brain a couple days ago, Shino-san. Call me Yugito. Yugito-san, then, he acquiesced. He gestured towards his workbench. Would you like to take a look at what nearly killed you? Morbid, she snorted. But sure. Yugito leaned over the table and peered into the twin ocular lenses he pointed out on the microscope. Under the harsh white light under the viewing table, she spied a few flat things writhing in the petri dish. These worms are of a chakra-consuming variety, Shino explained. He picked up a scalpel and directed her gaze to the thin, pink lines that sprouted from its ends. His fingers were covered in scars, she saw, and it seemed to extend past the bandages in his sleeves. They have the ability to mask themselves in what they devour, making it nearly undetectable for medics since they complete most screenings with chakra as well. So how did you spot them? I employ the use of non-chakra standard scans, he replied. Why, there is a chance to catch things that chakra cannot, as exhibited with your case. He set the lid on the petri dishes and raised his head back up to her. Prior to your admission to the hospital, have you gone swimming in questionable waters or consumed meat that hadn't been fully cooked? She blinked. Oh, I had some fish from a stagnant lake, but I thought I wouldn't have to worry about that if I cooked it through enough. Her gaze followed his hand as he jotted down bullet points on his notepad. Heat resistant. Devise experiment. Lifespan without viable hose. Continue current experiment. Living conditions. Follow up with C. Visit Cirrus Central's store rooms for more samples. He was a more competent medic, Yugito mused. When she'd woken up at the hospital mildly disoriented and Matabi hissing at her in furious worry in her head, C had come in shortly after with an account of just what happened to her and the fact that he hadn't been the attending medic at the time of the parasite's discovery. That probably surprised her more than anything. She was a younger Jinchuriki with far less social pull and experience than B, and much of the hospital staff were wary of taking her on ever since that incident of an intern burning their hands on Matabi's chakra and scorching the ends of those nerves. It wasn't like it was her fault the intern hadn't been paying attention, but the damage was already done and she was pushed further on the outskirts of Kumo's social circles. As long as you continue to take your medication as directed, all of the parasite residues should be cleared from your system and your name can return to the active mission roster in 2 weeks' time, Shino said. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. There are scars on his neck as well, Yugito-chan, Matabi remarked with lingering interest. Her tails flicked behind her in her host's mindscape. Those are most certainly self-inflicted. Yugito pulled back from the microscope and planted her hands on her hips. I've got just one. Who are you? His brow furrowed. Who am I? As in, my origins. I hail from Imvula. C told me the same thing, but I knew it was a lie from the moment he told me. And seeing you now only cements that truth, she said. The crease between Shino's eyebrows leveled out as he tucked both hands in his coat pockets. Other than that, you certainly don't have the subtle lilt in your vowels that all natives share. She smiled. It's quite a small border town, Shino-san, and while you and C have everyone else fooled, I'm sorry to say it hasn't swayed me. Then there's not much I can say, he admitted. It's all under C-sensei's jurisdiction, but all the time I spend out of the hospital is in Katatumbo Penitentiary. Why? Her eyes blew wide as they tried to search for the lie in his face. I'm certainly not a guard, which leaves the only other option. Yugito was stunned. Her life was saved by a foreign prisoner. Who knows I'm a Jinchuriki, but doesn't care regardless. And he must be trusted, especially after the stunt with her case, because he was the only one in this greenhouse and she knew C well enough that he would have never let a prisoner to themselves if they posed even the slightest threat to the village. And what does that mean to you? That if he doesn't care that you're with me, then. A smile was back on her face, but it was much softer than the last. I just remembered what I came here for. She bowed deeply, and Shino shuffled a surprised few steps backwards. I wanted to thank you for saving my life, and that you'll have my unending gratitude for everything you've done. Yugito-san, there's no need to thank me. Why? Because all I've done is my job, he protested. And that's more to say than a lot of other people, she replied with only a drop of resigned bitterness in her voice. But it was gone when she addressed him again as she took in just how young he was. Too young to have been captured and locked in Katatumbo. Too young to have possibly known about the parasites in her brain when no one else did. But here he was. I would have died if it weren't for you. He ducked his head. I had only done what was necessary. Matabi purred, satisfied. Ah, how modest. Such a rare find these days. Well, whatever you call it, I'm thankful for. Yugito glanced through the glass walls of the greenhouse. Sorry I have to cut this visit short. I need to meet with Reikage-sama to turn in my mission report. She flashed him one last smile before she headed for the exit. But I'll see you around. Let me know if you need anything, alright? She turned around. Actually, Yugito-san, could you do one thing for me? But the call from behind has her looking back over her shoulder. Please be careful when eating fish from dubious bodies of water, he deadpanned. Brain parasites truly aren't a prime source of nutrition. She laughed. I'll do my best. She would definitely pay more visits to the hospital from now on. And in June, the rain would swoon. Kiba had been combing out a pretty ridiculous knot from Akamaru's fur when his cell door clicked and swung open, revealing Darui in his usual uniform with his sword slung along his back. Kiba his head. Did ya need me for something else? He questioned slowly. Mabui-san walked me back probably, like, an hour ago, and it was pretty dark when we were coming back, so, oh shit, wait, are you guys gonna kill me? Like, is this it? Okay. Well, I guess it took you guys long enough, but I thought we really had a thing going. You're not getting executed, the Junin interrupted amusedly, holding off a snort at how the boy sagged in relief. Someone might as well have told him he wouldn't have to take a test and he would have reacted the same way. You're getting transferred to another cell. Get your things and come on. Another cell. Kiba hefted himself to his feet and swooped his scrolls, ink, and brushes into his arms, and Akamaru scrambled onto all fours and latched onto his partner's spare clothes. They were led out the hall and up the spiraling stairs instead of the usual downwards. Something wrong with ours? Did you like your old cell? Nah, it sucks, he answered honestly. This time, Darui did snort. But I'm pretty sure that was normal prisoner treatment. You sure we're definitely not getting killed? Do you want to be? No, but I'm just asking. They ended up somewhere on the top floors, Kiba noted cautiously. One had an open entrance with no door, and a quick glance inside showed him a clean space with room for storage. But the other had the same thick metal door as his old cell, and as Darui swung it open and ushered him inside, he saw. He blinked. And again. Then he rubbed his eyes with his sleeves and blinked a few more times and strained himself to make sure his eyes weren't acting up. The new cell was as big as Sakura's apartment back in Konoha. The walls were painted a cream color and a bookshelf spanned an entire half of one wall. To its right was a plain gray couch and to the wall adjacent was a cluster of beds that Akamaru carefully poked at with a damp nose. What's? Across from the bookshelf was a connecting door that led to a bathroom equipped with a single sink, a toilet, and a shower head all surrounded by white tile. Kiba slowly set his things down on the small brown table near the shelf and turned towards the door. What's this? Darui gestured lazily. Your new cell. At the sight of Kiba gazing up at him with some newfound wonder, he averted his eyes. Shame, it must have been when he reflected on it later. This is the 9th month you've been at Katatumbo and the 6th month you've loaned your services to the SEALs division. Mabui-san and I were able to pull a couple of strings. He hummed. Well, us and a few others. He coughed to clear his throat. I'll leave you to settle down. The door shut but Kiba barely heard it. One of his hands dropped to thread through the fur on Akamaru's head. He didn't know how long he stood there staring at the clean walls and carpeted floor and the couch he could already imagine himself taking day-long naps on. He couldn't remember the feeling of sleeping on something that didn't have springs digging into his back or wasn't a concrete floor. The other cell was a gray brick with nothing in it and the Colosseum cell had just been a rotting, dilapidated. Akamaru barked frantically, and Kiba's head snapped over to the beds. Beds. Plural. That. There was the sound of the door unlocking again and he spun around, nearly knocking his shin into the table. Shino walked in, and they made eye contact for the first time in 9 months. Oof. Kiba couldn't manage another syllable as he was lifted into the air and crushed into sturdy arms and the deafening sound of kikaichu buzzes. A face pressed into the crook of his neck and a pair of arms locked around his middle like they hung on for dear life, and before he knew it, he was stifling the choked sobs that clogged his throat as he wrapped his own arms around his friend's neck and breathed in the familiar scent of herbs and antiseptic and old books. You grew out your hair, Kiba sniffed, a hand coming up to feel the high bun atop Shino's head. And you got new earrings, Shino mumbled. They pulled away with their hands still on each other's sleeves, and Shino braced himself to keep steady as the now enormous Akamaru dove into his side. Kiba grinned sheepishly and scratched the back of his head. So I got a story about that, actually. What does that mean? Okay, but don't get mad. Akamaru suddenly wiggled until he was back on the ground, his tail wagging so fast it was nearly a blur. Kiba and Shino shifted back towards the door. It wasn't closed. and Sakura stood in the threshold, over a full head taller than them both and pink hair cropped to the base of her neck. More tears burst past Kiba's eyes and he shouted the first thing that popped in his head. "Why the air you so tall, you goddamn Sasquatch?" He ran and jumped into her good arm latching around his waist as he clung on. Shino and Akamaru weren't too far behind and their combined weights were enough to barrel them all into a pile by the bookshelf. Kiba's shoulders smacked against the table, Sakura knocked the back of her head on the floor, Shino ended up a starfish over the both of them with all of Akamaru's paws planted on his back. "I'm not tall," Sakura murmured. Her right arm held Kiba as close as she could hold him and she buried her face on the top of Shino's head. "Not my fault you can't grow." She still smelled of polished steel and fresh bandages and rain at its most violent, and it only made Kiba cry harder. It had been so long since he'd felt this warm. It had been so long since he'd been home.